My husband of 28 years looked at his young mistress, laughed, a sound that chilled my blood, and whispered that even my dog deserved more love than me. He thought I was just an invisible workhorse, waiting to be discarded so he could steal my life's work. He had no idea that I held the master keys to his entire existence. I simply packed a single suitcase, walked out into the night, and silently triggered the collapse of his entire empire. I stood in the deep shadows of the Oak Creek Country Club terrace. My fingers gripped the delicate stem of a crystal champagne flute so tightly my knuckles turned a stark bone white. Inside the grand ballroom, bathed in the warm golden glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers, my husband Richard was holding court. His voice, rich and deeply charismatic, echoed through the open French doors, carrying over the smooth jazz playing in the background. He was giving a speech to our church elders, our community friends, and the board members of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. He was playing the role of the devoted Christian family man and brilliant corporate founder to absolute perfection. To 28 years of incredible blessings, he proclaimed, raising his glass to the thunderous applause of the crowd. To a community built on unwavering faith, trust, and deep loyalty. I could hear the clinking of expensive glassware and the murmurs of admiration from the wives of other executives. They all thought Richard was a saint. I had stepped out onto the terrace just moments before suffocating under the heavy weight of his perfectly tailored lies. The warm, humid air of the Texas evening offered a brief respite from the cloying atmosphere inside. Beside me sat Bailey, my loyal golden retriever, leaning his heavy, comforting head against my knee. Bailey was a certified therapy dog, which was the only reason the strict club manager had allowed him out on the private terrace. He let out a soft whine, sensing the rigid tension that was currently radiating through my entire body. For 28 years, I had been the silent architect behind Sterling Heritage Real Estate. Richard was the charming, handsome face of the company. He was the man who shook hands at Sunday service, who charmed investors at charity galas, and who closed massive deals on the golf course. But I was the one who actually built the complex financial models. I was the one who navigated the intricate commercial tax codes. I was the one who had rescued the firm from the absolute brink of bankruptcy 3 separate times by liquidating my own personal retirement accounts and working 80-hour weeks while he slept. I was 54 years old, a woman who had poured every ounce of her youth, her intellect, and her soul into securing her husband's legacy. To the outside world, I was simply Richard's quiet and supportive wife. I was the invisible workhorse. I smoothed the fabric of my conservative navy blue evening gown, trying to calm the sudden, inexplicably anxious racing of my heart. The sudden sharp crunch of gravel on the garden path directly below the terrace shattered the quiet night. Hushed voices murmured, approaching the secluded alcove of tall rose bushes just beneath the stone balcony where I stood hidden in the dark. I froze in place. I immediately recognized the heavy, intoxicating scent of Richard's bespoke sandalwood and citrus cologne drifting upward on the gentle evening breeze. But tonight, it was mixed with something else, a cloying, sickly, sweet floral perfume that immediately made my stomach churn with a violent wave of nausea. It was the undeniable signature scent of Ashley. She was our firm's flashy new 30-year-old director of acquisitions. "Why does she always have to be here?" Richard Ashley's voice whined, carrying a tone of petulant, spoiled entitlement. "I am so entirely sick of hiding in the dark corners while you play the loving, devoted husband in front of all these people. Every single time she looks at me with those tired, judging eyes, I feel like she knows about us." Richard let out a low, relaxed chuckle. It was a cold, incredibly cruel sound that I had never once heard within the walls of our own home. "Relax, babe," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "She does not suspect a thing. She's completely clueless. She's just buried in her spreadsheets, her tax audits, and her little church bake sales. She does not see anything outside of her ledgers." I felt a sickening, terrifying chill slide down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. My breath caught sharply in my throat, choking me. I stood utterly paralyzed on the terrace, unable to move a muscle, unable to make a single sound, as the man I had trusted implicitly with my entire life casually shredded my reality into pieces. "You have been saying that for 6 months." Ashley pressed, her voice rising with sharp irritation. "I want her gone, Richard. You promised me we would be together properly before the winter holidays. You promised me the new estate in Westlake, and you promised me I would not have to sneak around anymore. I am tired of waiting for you to handle this, and you will have it all." Richard's voice dropped into a smooth, placating purr. It was the exact same charming, hypnotic tone he used to close multi-million-dollar acquisitions. "You just need to be a little more patient, my love. The legal papers are almost ready. You know, I cannot just leave her without protecting the assets first. Half of the company is technically tied to her name. If I file for a standard divorce right now, she will take me to the cleaners and ruin everything we are trying to build for our future." "Then what are you doing about it?" Ashley demanded. "I am moving the funds," Richard explained smoothly, sounding incredibly proud of his own deceit. "I have been slowly siphoning the liquid corporate funds into the new shell company under your name. The offshore escrow accounts in the Caymans are almost fully funded. Once the cash is totally secured out of her reach, I am going to have my private doctors evaluate her." "Evaluate her?" Ashley asked, sounding confused. "For what?" "For severe mental instability," Richard replied with a dark, cruel laugh. "I have been documenting her stress levels, her late nights, her supposed paranoia. With the right medical paperwork, I can have her temporarily committed to a psychiatric facility for observation. A judge will grant me emergency medical power of attorney. That gives me the legal right to completely nullify her founding shares and transfer total operational control strictly to myself. By the time she gets out, she will have absolutely nothing. No money, no company, no power. I'm just keeping the old workhorse around right now to keep the IRS off our backs until the offshore transfers are complete." Ashley let out a soft, delighted gasp. "You're terrible," she giggled, leaning into him. "But what if she fights back? What if she realizes what you are doing to her?" "She will not." Richard dismissed the idea instantly. "She is weak. She has spent her entire life serving me. She has no friends outside of our church circle, and they will all side with me when I tell them she has lost her mind. Honestly, even her dog deserves more love than her. She's just a boring, exhausting machine. I cannot wait to be totally rid of her and finally start my real life with you." The word struck me with the brutal, staggering force of a physical blow to the chest. Even her dog deserves more love than her. A psychiatric facility. Stealing my shares. The crystal champagne flute in my hand trembled so violently that the sparkling liquid splashed over the gold rim, wetting my shaking fingers with a cold, sticky residue. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped wild bird, desperately trying to smash its way out of a cage. A wave of profound visceral nausea hit me so incredibly hard, I had to lean heavily against the rough stone balustrade just to keep my legs from completely giving out beneath me. My breathing became shallow and jagged. The world around me spun in a dizzying blur of betrayal and horror. 28 years of absolute sacrifice. 28 years of carefully managing his ledgers, forgiving his supposed late nights at the office building, the very financial foundation he now stood upon. I remembered the early days of our marriage, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, eating boxed macaroni and cheese so we could afford the filing fees for his first commercial real estate license. I remember taking out a second mortgage on my childhood home, the only thing my late parents had left me, just to keep his business afloat when the market crashed. I had skipped vacations, I had worn the same conservative suits for years, and I had delayed starting a family because he always told me the business needed to be perfectly stable first. All of it reduced to nothing but a pathetic joke to impress a 30-year-old woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. I was not a wife to him. I was not a partner. I was an old workhorse, meant to be drained of every ounce of value and then thrown into a psychiatric ward so he could steal the empire I built with my own two hands. I looked down at Bailey. The golden retriever sensed my agonizing distress and nudged my cold hand with his warm, wet nose, letting out another soft, empathetic whimper. His thick golden fur brushed against my leg, offering a simple, unconditional affection that my husband had failed to provide for over a decade. A single hot tear escaped my eye, tracing a burning, scalding path down my pale cheek. It was a tear of mourning for the life I thought I had, for the man I thought I knew, for the decades of my youth that I could never, ever get back. I raised my trembling hand and wiped the tear away, and in that exact split second, as my skin felt the dampness of my own profound sorrow, something fundamental inside me snapped. The naive, devoted, and endlessly forgiving wife I had been for nearly 3 decades died right there on the dark terrace of the Oak Creek Country Club. She was incinerated by the absolute cruelty of his words. The crushing, agonizing pain in my chest instantly burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly calm fury. The frantic pounding of my heart slowed, settling into a steady, lethal rhythm. I did not scream out into the night. I did not storm down the stone stairs to confront them in the garden. I did not run inside to throw my champagne in his face or make a hysterical scene in front of our church friends and colleagues. That is exactly what a broken, defeated woman would do. That is exactly what Richard expected a weak, mentally unstable woman to do. He wanted me to act crazy. He wanted me to lose my mind, so his narrative would be perfect. He needed me to be the unstable, older wife who could not handle the pressure, so his friends and investors would pity him when he forcefully committed me against my will. But I was not just a woman, and I was certainly not a fool. I was a master forensic accountant. I spent my entire life dissecting complex corporate fraud tracing, hidden offshore accounts, and destroying financial criminals in federal audits before I gave it all up to build his business. I knew the numbers, I knew the access codes, I knew every single hidden vulnerability in the real estate empire he arrogantly thought he owned. The sickening chill in my spine hardened into a steely, unbreakable resolve. I turned away from the balcony overlooking the rose bushes, my mind already shifting rapidly into high gear. The emotional fog evaporated, leaving only the sharp clinical clarity of a professional auditor facing a hostile target. I was running algorithms, legal strategies, and digital retaliation sequences in my head. Richard thought he had outsmarted me. He truly believed he could manipulate the legal system, steal my life's work, declare me insane, and use my money to fund a lavish new life with his flashy mistress. He thought because I was quiet, because I worked in the shadows, that I was powerless. He was about to learn the most devastating and expensive lesson of his pathetic life. He had forgotten one crucial detail in his arrogant master plan. I built the entire digital infrastructure of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. I set up the firewalls, I encrypted the corporate servers, and I was the sole administrator who authorized the commercial banking portals. I placed my empty champagne flute on a passing waiter's silver tray with a soft, deliberate clink. I smoothed my dress one final time, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. I looked down at my dog. "Come on, Bailey," I whispered, my voice steady and cold as winter ice. "We have work to do." I walked back through the grand ballroom, moving like a ghost through the crowd of laughing wealthy guests. I did not look at the glowing crystal chandeliers. I did not look at the grand stage where my husband had just stood, spouting his miserable lies to the congregation. I walked straight out the heavy oak front doors of the country club, out into the warm Texas night, stepping into a brand new reality. I was going to pack my bags. I was going to take my dog. And then I was going to systematically, utterly, and legally obliterate Richard's entire world. Never underestimate the woman who holds the master keys to the vault. The drive back to our estate was cloaked in a suffocating silence. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my modest sedan so tightly my hands ached. Beside me in the passenger seat, Bailey rested his heavy golden head on the center console, offering a quiet, comforting presence. The humid Texas night air whipped through the cracked window, but it did nothing to cool the burning fire of betrayal raging inside my chest. I had slipped away from the country club gala completely unnoticed. Richard was far too busy basking in the adoration of his peers, too busy playing the devout, charismatic community leader to realize his invisible workhorse of a wife had just bolted from the stable. Our home sat at the end of a long, sweeping driveway in one of the most exclusive gated communities in the state. I parked the car and stared up at the massive stone facade. It was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate that I had entirely financed through my relentless, meticulous financial planning. Richard had chosen the towering columns, the imported marble floors, and the extravagant landscaping to stroke his own massive ego. For 28 years, I had viewed this house as our shared sanctuary. Tonight, it looked exactly like what it truly was, a beautifully decorated monument to a lifetime of lies. I unlocked the heavy custom oak front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The absolute stillness of the house pressed against my ears. I kicked off my conservative navy heels, leaving them haphazardly on the pristine rug. I did not bother turning on the main crystal chandeliers. I walked barefoot across the cold, polished marble, my mind racing with a singular, terrifyingly clear purpose. I headed straight down the long mahogany-paneled hallway toward Richard's private study. Richard always treated his study like an impenetrable fortress. He had a heavy lock installed on the door and often joked with our dinner guests that it was his absolute sanctuary where the genius of sterling heritage real estate happened. He firmly believed he was a master of corporate strategy, but Richard was a man built entirely on vanity and surface-level charm. He possessed absolutely no understanding of the deep, complex digital architecture that kept his empire functioning. He had completely forgotten that I was the one who personally coded the firm's firewalls, configured our secure virtual private networks, and established every single administrative protocol. I pushed open the heavy double doors of his study. The room smelled strongly of his expensive aged scotch and the rich leather of his imported Italian executive chair. The moonlight spilling through the tall arched windows cast long dark shadows across the room. I walked straight to his massive desk and pulled open the bottom right drawer. There, sitting exactly where I knew it would be, was his personal, supposedly secure tablet. I picked up the sleek device. The screen lit up, casting a harsh, cold glow across my face. A password prompt blocked my access. Richard had always been arrogant enough to believe his digital life was completely safe from my tired, judging eyes. He assumed I was just a boring older woman who only understood spreadsheets and church bake sales. He severely underestimated the forensic accountant he married. I did not even have to run a decryption software. I knew the man's monumental ego inside and out. I typed in the 4 digits of his own birth year, followed by the day he was named CEO of our firm. The screen instantly unlocked with a soft, validating click. My heart hammered against my ribs, a heavy, frantic rhythm as I navigated to his cloud storage application. The interface loaded, displaying a series of neatly organized folders. He had not even bothered to hide them properly. He was so incredibly confident in my blind devotion that he left the blueprint of my destruction sitting right on his virtual desktop. I opened the folder labeled Personal Finance. As my eyes scanned the digitized bank statements and wire transfer logs, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. My worst fears, the horrific truths I had overheard behind the rose bushes, were laid out before me in black and white. I saw the massive hemorrhaging of our corporate funds. Over the past 8 months, Richard had systematically authorized dozens of wire transfers, siphoning millions of dollars out of our primary operating accounts. He had disguised them as vendor payments and consulting fees. But I was a forensic auditor. My brain naturally unraveled the numeric web. The money was being funneled directly into a newly registered, limited liability company called Crimson Acquisitions. I pulled up the state registration documents nested in the very next folder. The sole managing director of Crimson Acquisitions was Ashley. He was draining the lifeblood of the company I had built from the ground up to fund a lavish shell corporation for his 30-year-old mistress. I watched the digital trail cross international borders, routing from Delaware to a highly guarded offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He was bleeding us dry and hoarding the cash where American courts would struggle to touch it. He was creating a multi-million-dollar nest egg for his new life while I was sitting at home balancing our domestic checkbook to save money on groceries. A sharp, bitter taste flooded my mouth, but the financial theft, as devastating as it was, did not compare to the absolute horror waiting for me in the next directory. I tapped on an encrypted messaging application that Richard had foolishly allowed to sync directly to his cloud backup. The chat logs between him and Ashley populated the screen. I forced myself to read the vile, sickening exchanges. They mocked my conservative clothes. They laughed about my quiet demeanor. Ashley complained constantly about having to wait in the shadows, while Richard reassured her with promises of a massive estate and endless luxury. Then I saw the message that made my blood run completely cold. Ashley had written asking if the legal trap was finally ready. Richard had replied with a chillingly casual tone. He told her not to worry. He said the medical trap was perfectly set and the old workhorse would be locked away before the first snowfall. My fingers trembled violently as I backed out of the chat and opened a folder simply titled Legal Action. Inside were several high-resolution scanned documents. I clicked on the first PDF file and my stomach plummeted into a bottomless abyss. It was a fully drafted legal petition for emergency medical power of attorney. I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. Attached to the petition were three separate psychiatric evaluation forms. They were signed by a Dr. William Prescott, a high society psychiatrist who frequently golfed with Richard at the country club. The medical notes were entirely fabricated. They described me as severely depressed, highly erratic, and suffering from paranoid delusions. The documents falsely claimed I had been exhibiting dangerous suicidal tendencies and was entirely unfit to manage my own basic affairs. The sheer level of calculated malice was paralyzing. Richard was not just planning to divorce me. A divorce would mean a legal division of assets. A divorce would mean I would rightfully take half of the multi-million-dollar company I had personally salvaged from ruin. Richard was too greedy for a divorce. He wanted absolutely everything. By using these forged medical documents, he planned to have me involuntarily committed to a private psychiatric facility. Once I was locked away behind secure doors, he would present this emergency power of attorney to a judge. The court would grant him total unilateral control over all my personal decisions, my bank accounts, and most importantly, my founding shares in Sterling Heritage Real Estate. He was going to legally erase my entire existence, strip me of my life's work, and leave me rotting in a psychiatric ward while he lived in a mansion with a woman 26 years his junior. I sat in the heavy leather chair, the cold light of the tablet illuminating the absolute ruin of my 28-year marriage. The silence of the grand study was deafening. I thought about the decades I had spent faithfully loving this man. I thought about the countless nights I stayed awake agonizing over tax codes to protect him from audits. I thought about the children we never had because he constantly insisted the timing was never right. It was not the timing. It was because he never truly loved me. I was never a wife to him. I was simply a highly efficient financial tool, a human calculator he kept on a shelf until he no longer needed me. A profound, agonizing wave of grief crashed over me, threatening to completely break my spirit. The pain was so intense, so incredibly sharp, that it felt like my chest was being physically crushed under the weight of a massive stone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the crystal decanters on his mahogany desk. I wanted to collapse onto the floor and weep until I could no longer breathe. But as a hot, solitary tear rolled down my cheek and splashed onto the illuminated screen of the tablet, something deep within my soul shifted. I watched that tear distort the digital signature on the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. And in that exact fleeting moment, the overwhelming sorrow suddenly evaporated. The agonizing heartbreak was instantly incinerated by a hot, blinding flash of pure, unadulterated rage. The fire burned away the naive, loyal, and endlessly forgiving wife I had been for nearly 3 decades. She died right there, in the heavy leather chair of that pretentious study. What rose from her ashes was the woman Richard had completely forgotten. The ruthless, meticulous, and brilliant forensic accountant. The woman who could track a single missing dollar through a labyrinth of international shell companies. The woman who held the master keys to the entire digital and financial architecture of his empire. He thought I was weak. He thought my silence was a symptom of stupidity. He thought he could outsmart the architect of his own fortress. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman he married. I did not operate with loud, hysterical emotions. I operated with cold, hard, undeniable facts. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. My skin felt cool, dry, and tight. The trembling in my fingers vanished entirely, replaced by a rock-solid, unnatural steadiness. I placed the tablet down on the mahogany desk and powered up my own personal laptop. If Richard wanted to play a game of corporate warfare, he was about to discover that I owned the entire battlefield. I was not going to cry over a man who viewed me as disposable livestock. I was going to systematically dismantle his life. I would strip away his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. I would take the very empire I built and let it crash down directly onto his arrogant head. Bailey whined softly from the doorway, sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere. The golden retriever trotted over and placed his warm chin on my knee. I reached down and stroked his soft fur. My eyes locked intensely on my computer screen. "Do not worry, Bailey," I whispered, my voice sounding entirely unrecognizable even to my own ears. It was smooth, lethal, and stripped of all warmth. "He said you deserved more love than me. Well, we are going to make sure he loses absolutely everything he loves." My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating the secure login sequence for the corporate server. I bypassed the standard security protocols and entered the encrypted administrator domain. The entire financial nervous system of Sterling Heritage Real Estate lay completely exposed at my fingertips. The war had officially begun, and I was going to ensure Richard never saw the fatal blow coming. The heavy mahogany doors of Richard's study closed behind me with a soft, definitive click. I stood in the long, silent hallway of our Texas estate, letting the reality of my new existence settle over my shoulders. For 28 years, this massive house had been my sanctuary. I had personally chosen the imported Italian marble beneath my bare feet. I had curated the expensive artwork lining the walls to project the perfect image of a highly successful Christian real estate mogul. I had built the entire facade that Richard used to charm investors and seduce 30-year-old acquisitions directors. But tonight, the house felt like a meticulously decorated tomb. I walked up the sweeping grand staircase, my golden retriever Bailey following closely at my heels. His nails clicked softly against the polished hardwood, a rhythmic sound that grounded me in the present moment. I bypassed the massive walk-in closet filled with designer evening gowns and expensive silk blouses. Those items were bought with Sterling Heritage corporate funds. They were costumes purchased to make me look the part of a compliant corporate wife. I did not want them. They belonged to a woman who no longer existed. Instead, I walked straight to the back of the closet and pulled out a simple battered black canvas suitcase. It was the same suitcase I had used on our honeymoon to a cheap cabin in Colorado, back when we were young and supposedly in love, back when Richard swore I was the only woman he would ever need. I placed it on the perfectly made California king bed. My packing was clinical and ruthless. I took 3 pairs of practical slacks, a few cotton blouses, comfortable walking shoes, and my basic toiletries. I left behind the heavy diamond tennis bracelets, the pearl necklaces, and the platinum watches Richard had gifted me after closing major deals. Every piece of jewelry felt like a shiny, heavy chain meant to keep me tethered to a man who despised me. I tossed them carelessly onto his velvet armchair. Next, I walked into my personal home office adjacent to the master suite. This was my true domain. I knelt on the plush carpet and pried up a loose floorboard hidden perfectly beneath my heavy oak desk. Inside a fireproof lockbox lay the true heart of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. I pulled out 4 encrypted solid-state hard drives and my personal titanium laptop. These drives contained every single raw data file, every original tax return, every offshore routing number, and every digital signature I had ever archived. Richard thought he was a mastermind for syncing his tablet to the cloud. He completely failed to realize that I owned the cloud itself. I placed the heavy drives into my canvas suitcase, zipping it shut with a sharp final sound. I carried the bag downstairs, leaving it by the front door. Bailey sat patiently beside it, wagging his tail. He sensed we were going on a trip, but before I could walk out of that front door forever, I had a critical technical strike to execute. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen. The room was spotless, gleaming with stainless steel appliances and pristine white quartz countertops. I set my titanium laptop on the massive center island and flipped the screen open. The soft glow of the monitor illuminated the dark kitchen. I connected to the secure local network and initiated a sequence I had designed years ago. When I first designed the domestic server architecture for Sterling Heritage, I realized very early on that the commercial real estate market was full of predatory players. Richard loved to take all the public credit for our rapid growth, but he lacked the fundamental intelligence required to safeguard the immense capital we were constantly moving. He attended the flashy luncheons and shook hands with city council members, but he never understood how a single compromised wire transfer could instantly bankrupt a firm of our size. I had spent countless nights coding advanced security algorithms completely from scratch because I wanted to ensure my husband would never fail. I built an impenetrable fortress around him because I loved him. And now I was using that exact same fortress to completely entomb him. When I originally built the digital infrastructure for our real estate firm, I engineered a fail-safe mechanism. In the cybersecurity world, it is known as a dead man's switch. I initially created it to protect our corporate assets from hostile external takeovers or federal seizures. if the primary administrator account went dark or was compromised, the switch would automatically trigger a massive internal lockdown. The system would freeze all liquid capital, scramble the access credentials, and reroute administrative control to a heavily encrypted offline server. Richard had absolutely no idea this protocol existed. He barely knew how to convert a document to a PDF without asking his young mistress for help. I typed my master credentials into the terminal. The screen flooded with cascading lines of code, displaying the global financial network of sterling heritage. I navigated directly to the executive access portal. I found Richard's primary user profile. With a few swift keystrokes, I completely wiped his administrative privileges. I deleted his biometric access, his remote login capabilities, and his digital authorization signatures. I systematically revoked his ability to move even a single dollar of corporate funds. The dead man switch was elegantly simple in its execution, but incredibly devastating in its scope. I had buried the activation command deep within the primary payroll directory, where no outside auditor or IT consultant would ever think to look. As my fingers typed the final execution command, I felt a profound sense of closure. The terminal screen flashed green. A simple text prompt appeared confirming that all secondary administrative credentials had been permanently wiped from the Active Directory. Richard's name was officially erased from the system. If he tried to access the corporate banking portal to finalize his $50 million land acquisition for his mistress, the system would not just deny him. It would actively lock his IP address. If he attempted to call our private wealth managers to manually bypass the digital freeze, they would discover that his authorization pins had been completely scrambled. He would be entirely powerless. He would be reduced to a frantic, screaming man staring at a blank monitor. Then I turned my attention to Crimson Acquisitions. My fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a cold mechanical fury. I traced the specific routing numbers Richard had been using to siphon our hard-earned money into Ashley's shell company. I tracked the digital trail straight to the offshore escrow accounts in the Cayman Islands. Richard thought that money was safe. He thought international banking laws would protect his stolen nest egg. But those accounts were originally established using corporate identification codes that I personally generated. I accessed the offshore banking portal and triggered a total asset freeze. I changed the security tokens and locked the funds behind a 32-character alphanumeric encryption wall. I did not steal the money. I simply trapped it in a digital purgatory where neither Richard nor his greedy mistress could ever reach it. Ashley clearly thought she had secured her golden parachute. She probably spent her days browsing luxury real estate listings in Westlake, completely confident that Crimson Acquisitions was a bulletproof financial vessel. She did not realize that an offshore account is only as secure as the encryption key that binds it. By scrambling the alphanumeric security tokens, I effectively turned her multi-million-dollar Cayman Island nest egg into a digital ghost. The money was physically there, sitting in an impenetrable vault, but the vault doors were welded shut. The sheer panic they would both experience when they realized their stolen fortune was untouchable brought a tight, cold smile to my lips. Finally, I executed the dead man switch on the primary domestic server. I hit the enter key and watched the progress bar hit 100%. The entire digital foundation of Richard's empire was now sealed inside a vault, and I had just swallowed the only key. I closed my laptop. The kitchen plunged back into quiet shadows. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the massive empty house. I looked down at my left hand. The 3-carat diamond wedding ring caught a faint glimmer of moonlight spilling through the window. It felt incredibly heavy and entirely suffocating. I slowly slid the cold metal off my finger. The skin underneath was pale and indented, marking 28 years of wasted loyalty. I placed the ring squarely in the center of the pristine white quartz kitchen island. I did not leave a dramatic handwritten note. I did not leave a tear-stained letter begging for an explanation. A note would show that I still cared. A note would give him power. The absolute silence of my departure and the solitary diamond ring, left like a piece of discarded trash, would send a much louder message. It was the perfect monument to a man who valued money over human devotion. I picked up my laptop bag and walked to the front door. I grabbed the handle of my battered canvas suitcase. "Come on, Bailey," I said softly. "Time to go home." The golden retriever let out a happy little snort and trotted eagerly beside me. We walked out the heavy oak front doors and pulled them shut. I did not bother to lock them. There was nothing left inside that house worth protecting. I walked past Richard's gleaming imported sports car sitting proudly in the circular driveway. Instead, I approached my modest, reliable, dark grey sedan parked in the shadows near the garage. It was a vehicle I bought entirely, with my own modest personal savings, years before Richard's ego demanded a luxury fleet. It was unassuming, invisible, and perfectly functional, exactly the way Richard had always viewed me. I opened the passenger door and Bailey happily jumped into the front seat, settling his large warm body onto the upholstery. I loaded my single suitcase into the trunk and slid behind the steering wheel. The engine roared to life with a quiet, steady hum. I rolled down the windows, letting the thick, humid Texas night air wash over my face. The scent of blooming jasmine and wet asphalt filled the car, replacing the suffocating smell of Richard's expensive cologne. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the sprawling estate. The tires crunched softly against the gravel. I drove through the winding, perfectly manicured streets of our exclusive gated community. The massive houses of our wealthy neighbors sat in total darkness, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was about to rock their social circles by sunrise. I pulled up to the main security gates. The heavy iron bars slowly swung open, granting me exit into the sprawling dark expanse of the Texas highway system. I accelerated, merging onto the empty interstate. The yellow streetlights blurred past, flashing rhythmically across the windshield. Bailey rested his heavy chin on the center console, gazing up at me with large, soulful brown eyes. I reached over and stroked his soft golden ears. He let out a contented sigh, resting his warm head against my thigh. Richard was right about one thing. This dog absolutely deserved more love than him. Sitting in my modest sedan racing down the interstate, I felt the cool wind whipping my hair. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement was like a steady drumbeat, marching me toward my new life. I had no idea where I was going to sleep tonight, and I frankly did not care. I had my encrypted hard drives safely stored in the trunk, containing all the leverage I would ever need. I glanced in the rearview mirror one final time. The towering silhouettes of the affluent suburb faded into the pitch-black distance. There were no tears left in my eyes. There was no hesitation in my heart. The agonizing heartbreak that had nearly crushed me on the country club terrace had completely vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, intoxicating sense of absolute liberation. For the first time in 28 years, I was not worrying about Richard's schedule. I was not stressing over his corporate tax liabilities or managing his pristine public image. I was finally completely and utterly free. The naive, devoted wife had been left behind in that cold, empty mansion along with a useless diamond ring. The woman driving down the Texas highway was a weapon, and she was fully loaded. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, feeling the engine surge with power as the car swallowed the miles of dark asphalt. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise. Tomorrow morning, Richard would wake up with a terrible hangover and a smug sense of victory. Tomorrow morning, he would log onto his computer and discover that the invisible workhorse he mocked behind the rose bushes had just burned his entire kingdom to the ground. Let him enjoy his final few hours of ignorance. The storm was coming, and I was the one bringing the lightning. The morning sun pierced through the towering arched windows of the master suite, casting long, sharp beams of light across the imported Italian marble floor. Richard groaned as the harsh light hit his face. He rolled over in the massive California king bed, his head pounding with a dull, throbbing ache from the expensive scotch he had consumed at the country club gala the night before. He reached out his arm, expecting to find my side of the bed neatly made as usual, but the sheets were completely cold and untouched. He slowly sat up, rubbing his bloodshot eyes, and ran a hand through his perfectly styled silver hair. The sprawling estate was suffocatingly silent. There was no smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting up the grand staircase. There was no sound of Bailey the golden retriever clicking his nails across the hardwood floors. Richard dragged himself out of bed, wrapping a heavy silk robe around his broad shoulders. He walked down the mahogany-paneled hallway, his bare feet slapping against the cold, polished stone. He descended the sweeping staircase and entered the gourmet kitchen. The room was immaculate, gleaming with stainless steel and pristine white quartz countertops. And there, sitting squarely in the dead center of the massive kitchen island, was a single undeniable object: my 3-carat diamond wedding ring. It caught the morning light, sparking with a cold, brilliant fire. Richard stopped in his tracks and stared at the ring. For a brief second, a flicker of confusion crossed his handsome face. He walked closer, picking up the heavy piece of jewelry. He looked around the pristine kitchen, half expecting me to walk out of the pantry, weeping and begging for his forgiveness. But the house remained completely dead and silent. Then a slow, arrogant smirk curled his lips. He let out a loud, hollow laugh that echoed through the empty kitchen, bouncing off the high ceilings. To a man entirely consumed by his own monumental ego, my silent departure was not a warning. It was a massive convenience. He turned the ring over in his fingers with a look of absolute triumph. He assumed I had finally cracked under the pressure of our failing marriage. He truly believed I had packed a small bag and run off to cry on my sister's couch in the suburbs. In his twisted mind, this made his master plan incredibly easy. A wife who abandons her home in the middle of the night, leaving her wedding ring behind, is the perfect picture of a woman suffering a severe mental breakdown. He tossed the ring carelessly onto the counter, entirely convinced that his path to claiming my founding shares was now completely clear of any obstacles. He poured himself a glass of iced water, feeling an overwhelming sense of victory. The tedious, exhausting work of pretending to be a loving husband was finally over. He was free. 2 hours later, Ricard pulled his gleaming imported sports car into the reserved executive parking space at the sleek glass and steel headquarters of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. He was dressed in a flawless charcoal power suit, his posture radiating the absolute authority of a man who believed he owned the entire world. The sharp, intoxicating scent of his bespoke sandalwood and citrus cologne masked the lingering smell of stale scotch. He strode through the bustling lobby, nodding to the employees who murmured their respectful greetings. The receptionist smiled brightly, the junior executives stepped out of his way, and the security guards tipped their hats. He fed off their admiration completely, unaware that he was walking straight into a digital graveyard. He stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the top floor. The moment the polished metal door slid open, Ashley was waiting for him. She wore a daring designer dress that clung tightly to her figure. Her lips painted a bright, garish shade of red. The cloying, sickly, sweet smell of her cheap floral perfume filled the corridor. She threw her arms around his neck, pressing herself against him, oblivious to the passing staff. "Did she leave?" Ashley whispered, her voice trembling with eager anticipation. Richard smiled, his eyes gleaming with malicious pride. "She packed a bag and vanished in the middle of the night. She even left the ring. It is over, babe. By the time my private doctors finish drafting the psychiatric evaluation, she will be completely locked away in a facility. Today, we finalize the $50 million land acquisition for Crimson Acquisitions, and then we celebrate our brand new life." Ashley let out a delighted squeal, following him into his sprawling corner office. The room boasted floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling Texas skyline. Richard walked confidently to his massive mahogany desk and sat in his heavy leather executive chair. He opened his secure titanium laptop to execute the final wire transfer. This $50 million land deal was the crown jewel of his embezzlement scheme. It was designed to completely drain the primary corporate operating accounts and funnel the massive sum directly into Ashley's offshore shell company. He cracked his knuckles, stretching his fingers over the keyboard with the casual arrogance of a king surveying his conquered territory. He navigated to the secure corporate banking portal. He typed in his highly classified administrative username and entered his supposedly impenetrable alphanumeric password. He hit the enter key, expecting to see the familiar dashboard of liquid capital and routing options. Instead, the screen blinked. A stark, bright red dialog box popped up in the center of the monitor. "Access denied. Invalid administrative credentials." Richard frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in sudden annoyance. He assumed he had simply mistyped the complicated password. He carefully re-entered the characters, making sure every single letter and number was perfectly correct. He pressed the enter key a second time. The screen flashed again. "Access denied. Your administrative privileges have been permanently revoked by the primary system architect. Contact your network administrator." "What is wrong?" Ashley asked, leaning over his shoulder. her voice laced with a sudden sharp whine. Why is it taking so long? The sellers are waiting for the wire confirmation. If we do not send the 50 million right now, we are going to lose the Westlake property and all the development rights. Richard felt a tiny prick of cold sweat form at the base of his neck. The system is just glitching, he muttered, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. The old workhorse probably messed up a routine software update before she ran away crying. Give me a second. He aggressively mashed the refresh button on the browser. He tried to log into the secondary commercial accounts. Access denied. He tried to open the internal payroll directory to bypass the security wall. Access denied. He attempted to open the cloud storage application on his desktop to pull up the forged psychiatric evaluations he needed for his lawyers. The folder was entirely gone. It had not just been deleted. The entire directory had been wiped completely clean without leaving a single digital footprint. A sickening, terrifying chill began to slide down Richard's spine, freezing the blood in his veins. The confident, charismatic facade he wore so perfectly began to rapidly crack. His heart pounded against his ribs, a heavy, frantic rhythm of rising panic. He snatched his desk phone and furiously dialed the direct extension for the head of the IT department. "Pick up the phone, you useless idiots," he hissed, glaring at the red warning boxes multiplying across his computer screen. The IT director, a young, nervous man named David, answered on the third ring. "Get up to my office right now." Richard roared into the receiver, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I am locked out of the banking portal. The entire financial server is rejecting my security clearance. Fix it before I fire every single person in your department." He slammed the phone down his chest, heaving with hot, angry breaths. Ashley backed away from the desk, her eyes wide with mounting fear. Less than 2 minutes later, David sprinted into the executive office, his face completely drained of color. He was sweating profusely, gripping a diagnostic tablet in his shaking hands. "Mr. Sterling, I have been trying to call you all morning." David stammered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "The system is not glitching, sir. We have a massive catastrophic localized failure." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, standing up and slamming his palms flat against the mahogany desk. "I am the CEO of this company. I demand you override the system and grant me access to the operating funds immediately." David swallowed hard, taking a terrified step backward. "I cannot do that, sir. Nobody can do that." At precisely 2 a.m, a dead man switch was activated from the primary domestic server. The protocol completely encrypted the entire financial architecture of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. Richard stared at the young IT director, his mind struggling to process the technical jargon. "What the hell does that mean in English, David?" "It means we are locked out." David explained, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "The protocol revoked every single secondary administrative credential in the building. Your biometric access, your remote login capabilities, and your digital authorization signatures have all been permanently deleted. The system rerouted total operational control to a heavily encrypted offline server that we cannot even locate." Ashley let out a loud, piercing gasp. "What about Crimson Acquisitions?" she shrieked, her carefully maintained, elegant persona totally shattering. "What about the offshore escrow accounts in the Cayman Islands? Tell me that money is still there." David looked at her with pure confusion before turning his terrified gaze back to Richard. "Sir, the protocol targeted the international routing numbers too. The offshore funds are physically sitting in the bank, but the security tokens have been scrambled behind a 32-character alphanumeric encryption wall. The money is frozen in digital purgatory. You cannot transfer it. You cannot withdraw it. You cannot even view the balance." The room started to spin. Richard felt a wave of profound visceral nausea hit him so incredibly hard, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. The towering columns of his real estate empire were crumbling around him in real time. The $50 million land deal was dead. His hidden offshore fortune was untouchable. The forged medical documents he needed to declare his wife insane had vanished into thin air. He had no money, no leverage, and no power. "Break the encryption!" Richard screamed, a wild, desperate sound that tore from his throat. "Hack into the server and break the damn code. I will pay you $1 million right now. Just break the wall." David shook his head slowly, tears of pure stress forming in his eyes. "You do not understand, sir. The encryption algorithm is military grade. It would take a team of federal cyber analysts 10 years to brute force their way through that wall. There is only one person who possesses the master key. There is only one person who can reverse this protocol. Who? Richard bellowed, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Who has the master key? David took another step back, pointing a trembling finger at the blank computer screen. The system logs show that the encryption was authorized and executed by the sole primary architect of our network infrastructure. The command was executed by Rebecca Sterling. The name hung in the cold, air-conditioned office like a death sentence. Rebecca, the woman he mocked behind the rose bushes. The invisible workhorse he planned to lock away in a psychiatric ward. The naive, devoted wife he thought had run away crying with nothing but a suitcase. He suddenly remembered her silence over the last few weeks. He remembered the solitary diamond ring left on the quartz kitchen island. It was not a symbol of a broken woman surrendering her life. It was a calculated, deliberate declaration of absolute war. Richard collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair, all the blood draining from his handsome face. He was the CEO of one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the state. He had a net worth on paper of nearly $100 million. Yet at this exact moment, he could not even authorize a $5 transaction to buy a cup of coffee. His entire company was completely paralyzed. He had no way to pay his vendors, no way to pay his employees, and absolutely no way to finalize the deals that kept the company afloat. Ashley began to sob hysterically, realizing her dreams of mansions and unlimited wealth had just been incinerated. Richard sat completely frozen in the quiet office, the stench of his own cold fear mixing with the cloying floral perfume of his mistress. He finally realized the most devastating truth of his entire miserable existence. He had spent 28 years building a magnificent, towering fortress, but he had fundamentally forgotten that he was just a guest inside it. Rebecca owned the foundation, she owned the walls, and she owned the absolute control of every single lock. And she had just buried him alive inside his own kingdom. The morning sun reflected fiercely off the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Dallas, as I pulled my modest sedan into the underground parking garage of the city's most ruthless corporate law firm. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet darkness of the concrete structure for a brief moment. Bailey rested quietly in the back seat, his golden fur soft and comforting. I cracked the windows for him and promised I would return shortly. I grabbed the heavy leather tote bag sitting on the passenger seat. Inside the bag rested the 4 encrypted solid-state hard drives containing the complete financial anatomy of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. My heart was no longer pounding with the frantic, terrified rhythm of a betrayed wife. It was beating with the slow, measured, and lethal pulse of a woman preparing for war. I walked into the polished marble lobby of the firm and rode the silent high-speed elevator to the 42nd floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of dark mahogany and brushed steel designed specifically to make opposing counsel feel small. The receptionist greeted me immediately and escorted me down a long, quiet corridor to a massive corner office. Harrison was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Texas cityscape. He was a tall, imposing man in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. Harrison and I had met over 30 years ago, during our freshman year in the accounting program at the University of Texas. We had spent countless late nights studying corporate tax law and dissecting complex financial models. He eventually pivoted to corporate litigation, becoming one of the most feared and brilliant corporate attorneys in the state. He was a shark in the courtroom, known for dismantling hostile takeovers and crushing fraudulent executives without a single ounce of mercy. More importantly, Harrison was the only person in my life who had never been fooled by my husband. From the very day I introduced them decades ago, Harrison had looked straight through Richard's charming, charismatic facade. He had warned me back then that Richard was a man built entirely on vanity and reckless ambition. I was too young and too blindly in love to listen. Harrison turned away from the window as the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me. His sharp, observant eyes scanned my face, immediately registering the complete absence of my diamond wedding ring and the cold, unnatural stillness in my posture. He walked over to his sleek glass desk and poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe. He did not offer any meaningless platitudes or fake sympathy. He simply pushed a cup across the desk toward me and sat down. "You finally saw the man behind the curtain," Harrison said, his deep voice completely devoid of judgment. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. I pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out the 4 heavy metal hard drives, placing them squarely in the center of his pristine glass desk. The solid thud of the metal hitting the glass echoed loudly in the quiet office. "He is not just a fraud, Harrison," I said, my voice perfectly level and chilled to the bone. "He is a predator, and he is currently planning to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility so he can legally strip me of my founding shares and run away with a 30-year-old acquisitions director." Harrison froze with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Even for a man who spent his entire career dealing with the darkest corners of corporate greed, the sheer depravity of Richard's plan was staggering. He slowly lowered his cup, his jaw clenching so tightly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. A dangerous, predatory darkness settled over his eyes. "Tell me everything," Harrison commanded, pulling a fresh legal pad from his drawer and picking up a gold fountain pen. I did not shed a single tear as I recounted the events of the previous night. I spoke with the clinical, detached precision of a forensic auditor presenting a criminal dossier. I told him about the hushed conversation I overheard behind the rose bushes at the country club. I detailed the exact routing numbers Richard was using to siphon our corporate operating funds into the offshore shell company registered in his mistress's name. I explained the dead man's switch I had activated before walking out of the house, leaving Richard completely locked out of his own financial architecture. Finally, I described the fabricated medical evaluations Richard had purchased from a corrupt country club psychiatrist meant to declare me legally insane. Harrison wrote furiously, filling 3 pages of the legal pad with rapid, sharp strokes. When I finished speaking, the silence in the vast office was heavy and thick with tension. Harrison let out a slow, deep breath, tossing his pen onto the desk. "He wants to use an emergency medical power of attorney to bypass family court and seize your 50% stake in the company," Harrison stated, his mind already rapidly processing the legal angles. "It is a vile strategy, but tragically effective if he manages to get a judge to sign the commitment order before you realize what is happening. By the time you proved your sanity, the corporate accounts would be permanently drained." I took a slow sip of the bitter black coffee, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus. "He assumes I am a weak, obedient workhorse who will just roll over and disappear," I said. "He thinks he can lock me away and steal my entire life's work." Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass desk. He looked at me with a fierce protective loyalty that had survived 3 decades of friendship. "We are going to hit him with the most aggressive divorce petition this state has ever seen, Rebecca. I will file an emergency injunction to freeze every single personal and corporate asset tied to his name. I will have the court tear apart that offshore shell company, and we will file criminal fraud charges against that corrupt psychiatrist before noon tomorrow. Richard wants a war. We will give him a slaughter." I placed my hand flat on the glass desk, stopping him. I shook my head slowly. The icy resolve in my chest solidified into a diamond-hard core. "No, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "We are not going to file for a standard divorce. A divorce is exactly what he is preparing to fight. If we take this to family court, he will drag it out for years. He will hide behind his high-priced defense attorneys, and he will use the company's remaining revenue to bleed me dry in legal fees. I do not want a divorce settlement. I do not want half of the assets. I want his empire." Harrison frowned, leaning back in his leather chair. His sharp mind analyzed my words, searching for the logic. "Rebecca, you own exactly 50% of Sterling Heritage real estate. The corporate charter requires a majority board vote to force a leadership change. Even if we prove his embezzlement in civil court, removing him as chief executive officer without a clear voting majority will be a massive uphill battle." I reached out and placed my index finger on the top hard drive sitting on the desk. "That is where you are wrong, Harrison," I said softly. "I want you to go back 12 years. Do you remember the catastrophic failure of the Riverfront Commercial Plaza project?" Harrison narrowed his eyes, nodding slowly. "I remember it clearly. The primary structural contractor went bankrupt halfway through the build. a massive group of investors filed a $50 million class action lawsuit against Sterling Heritage for gross negligence and breach of contract. Richard was absolutely terrified. He thought he was going to lose the company, his personal wealth, and face federal prison time. He was terrified because he knew he was personally liable, I explained smoothly. He had illegally bypassed several zoning regulations to speed up the construction process. When the lawsuit hit his desk, he came to me sobbing like a frightened child. He begged me to use my financial expertise to shield our personal assets from the impending litigation. He needed a legal firewall to ensure that even if the investors won the lawsuit, they could not seize the core holding company. I leaned closer to Harrison, holding his gaze with absolute unwavering certainty. I built that firewall for him. I created an incredibly complex corporate structure called the Heritage Vanguard Trust. It was designed as an irrevocable blind trust. I drafted the legal documents transferring 60% of the primary voting shares of Sterling Heritage directly into that trust, thereby insulating the majority ownership from any personal litigation aimed at Richard. Harrison stared at me, his brilliant legal mind racing as he began to piece the puzzle together. Richard signed those transfer documents, Harrison asked, his voice tight with rising anticipation. He signed every single page. I replied, a cold, triumphant smile curving the corners of my lips. He was in such a frantic state of panic that he never even read the fine print. He just wanted the assets protected from the investors. He assumed the blind trust was managed by an anonymous third-party financial institution. He thought it was just a temporary legal shield that he could eventually dissolve once the lawsuit was settled out of court. But he never dissolved it, Harrison said, leaning forward, his eyes widening with realization. No, he did not, I confirmed. The lawsuit dragged on for 3 years before we finally settled. By the time it was over, Richard had completely forgotten about the internal share transfer. The company exploded in growth, and his ego grew right along with it. He spent the next decade parading around the country club believing he was the undisputed king of a massive real estate empire. He never once looked at the foundational corporate charter again. Harrison stared at the encrypted hard drives sitting on his desk as if they were solid bars of gold. He looked back up at me, a predatory, highly dangerous smile spreading across his face. Rebecca, who is the named trustee of the Heritage Vanguard Trust. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, projecting the absolute calm of a woman who held the world in her palm. The trust documents explicitly state that the sole irrevocable trustee holding absolute voting authority over those shares is me. The silence in the sleek glass office was absolute. Harrison let out a low, sharp breath of pure astonishment. The implications of what I had just revealed hung in the air, shifting the entire balance of power in a single heartbeat. Richard does not own the company. Harrison whispered, a profound sense of awe dripping from his words. He has not owned the majority share in over a decade. The 50% stake you hold jointly is totally meaningless because the Heritage Vanguard Trust holds the supermajority. Those are ghost shares to the public, but they are entirely legally binding. You own 60% of the voting power. Richard is nothing but a minority shareholder. He is literally just an employee working for his own wife. Exactly, I said, my voice ringing with lethal finality. He thinks I'm an invisible workhorse. He thinks I have been sitting in the dark entirely powerless while he builds his fortune. He has no idea that every time he sat at the head of that boardroom table, he was only there because I silently allowed it. And now I am revoking my permission. Harrison threw his head back and let out a rich, booming laugh that filled the large office. It was the laugh of a courtroom shark who had just been handed the most perfect, flawless weapon imaginable. He grabbed his gold fountain pen and pulled the legal pad back toward him, flipping immediately to a fresh page. "We are not filing for divorce," Rebecca Harrison said, his eyes shining with a ruthless, calculating fire. "We are executing a corporate hostile takeover from the inside." He began writing furiously, mapping out the strategic sequence. "We do not need a family court judge to divide the assets. You already own the controlling interest. We are going to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors. We will officially reveal the existence of the Heritage Vanguard Trust to the general partners. We will present the digital evidence of his gross fiduciary negligence, his systematic embezzlement, and his attempts to defraud the company through his mistress's shell corporation." And then I added my voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's blade. I will use my supermajority voting power to unilaterally terminate his employment as Chief Executive Officer for cause. We will completely strip him of his corporate access, his company vehicles, his expense accounts, and his public dignity. Harrison looked up from his legal pad, his expression hardening into an intimidating mask of professional brutality. When he tries to fight back, when he tries to claim the trust transfer was fraudulent, we will bury him in his own signed documents. And the moment he is officially terminated, we hand over the entire red folder of his tax evasion and offshore embezzlement directly to the federal authorities. He will not just leave the building unemployed, he will leave the building in handcuffs. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Texas city below. The morning sun was climbing higher, illuminating the concrete canyons where Richard had built his empire of lies. He had spent his entire morning screaming at his IT department, completely panicked over his locked bank accounts and frozen funds. He thought that was the extent of his problems. He thought it was just a temporary digital glitch holding up his new life with Ashley. He had absolutely no idea that a massive legal and corporate tsunami was rapidly forming right above his head. He had treated my devotion as a weakness. He had laughed behind the rose bushes and claimed my dog deserved more love than I did. I was going to ensure that by the time this week was over, he would be begging for the kind of shelter my dog enjoyed. Draft the corporate termination papers, Harrison. I said, standing up and smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. Ensure every single legal loophole is completely sealed shut. I want the board meeting scheduled for this Friday. Let him sweat over his frozen accounts for a few days. Let him feel the terrifying loss of control. Harrison stood up, matching my steely resolve. It will be an absolute massacre, Rebecca. I have never seen a trap this perfectly laid. I will have my team assemble the corporate notices immediately. I picked up my leather tote bag and turned toward the heavy glass door. I was no longer the heartbroken woman hiding on the country club terrace. I was the architect, and I was finally coming to reclaim my house. The silent exit was over. The loud, devastating collapse of his empire was about to begin. The digital death of Richard's daily routine was a fascinating thing to watch. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my temporary apartment, watching the collapse unfold in real time. Through the encrypted back door I had built into the Sterling Heritage servers, I could see every single frantic move he made. The financial alerts flashed across my computer screen like a cascade of red warning lights illuminating the dark room. His corporate credit cards were declining at high-end steakhouses downtown. The automated vendor payments for his luxury car leases were bouncing violently due to insufficient funds. He was bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. I could picture him sweating profusely in his custom-tailored suit, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he yelled at the bank tellers over the phone. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool of his own making, and he had absolutely no idea how to swim. Ashley was likely throwing massive tantrums in his office, realizing that the endless well of money she had been promised had suddenly dried up. The offshore accounts remained completely frozen, trapped behind the 32-character alphanumeric wall I had erected before leaving. Richard was utterly cornered. He had no access to the operating capital, and he could not secure a bridge loan because the system had flagged his administrative credentials as fundamentally compromised. The sheer terror of his situation must have been suffocating. But Richard was a creature of vanity and relentless manipulation. When a narcissist is backed into a corner, they do not surrender, and they certainly do not reflect on their own sins. They rewrite the narrative. They play the victim, and Richard was an absolute master of playing the victim. That Sunday morning, the blistering Texas sun beat down on the massive stained glass windows of the Grace Fellowship Presbyterian Church. It was the incredibly wealthy congregation we had attended for over 2 decades. We had donated heavily to the new building fund. I had hosted the pastoral staff at our estate for lavish holiday dinners, cooking for days to ensure everything was perfect. I knew exactly how Richard would use this sacred space to launch his public counterattack. I did not attend the service, but I did not need to be there to witness the spectacle. I had my laptop open on my small kitchen counter, streaming the Sunday service live from the church website. I watched as the high-definition camera panned across the polished oak pews filled with the local elite. Then Richard took the podium. He was not wearing his usual bright, charismatic smile. He looked intentionally disheveled. His perfect silver hair was slightly messy, and he wore a dark, somber suit that hung heavily on his broad shoulders. He gripped the edges of the wooden pulpit, lowering his head to project the perfect image of a broken, heartbroken man. The large congregation grew entirely silent, hanging on his every single word. He looked out at the sea of familiar faces and let out a shaky, theatrical breath. "My dear friends," Rigard began, his voice cracking with perfectly rehearsed emotion, "I stand before you today with a heavy and shattered heart. As many of you know, my beloved wife Rebecca has been struggling lately. The immense pressures of our business and the unseen burdens of her own mind have taken a terrible toll on her health." He paused, wiping a single dry eye with a crisp white handkerchief. The crocodile tears were flowing beautifully. He continued, spinning a web of deceit so incredibly thick it made my stomach churn with disgust. "She has suffered a severe mental breakdown. In her state of deep paranoid delusion, she drained our personal savings and vanished in the middle of the night. I have tried absolutely everything to find her, to get her the medical help she so desperately needs, but she has completely shut me out. I am asking for your prayers today. Pray for my poor sick wife. Pray that she returns home safely before her mind completely destroys her." The camera shifted to show the congregation. Wealthy women were dabbing their eyes with expensive tissues. Powerful men were shaking their heads in solemn pity. Richard had successfully weaponized our 28-year marriage. He had painted himself as the tragic, devoted husband abandoned by a crazy, unstable woman. The sheer audacity of his lies sent a sickening chill down my spine. The smear campaign did not stop at the church steps. By Tuesday afternoon, Richard had taken his fictitious tragedy directly to the Oak Creek Country Club. The country club was the ultimate echo chamber for the wealthy and privileged of Dallas. It was a place where reputations were meticulously built and brutally destroyed over expensive cocktails and rounds of golf. I received a highly detailed account of his performance from a former colleague who still worked closely with the club management. Richard held court in the exclusive men's grill, sipping top-shelf bourbon that he probably put on a tab he could no longer afford to pay. He leaned in close to the city council members, the real estate developers, and the local judges, spinning his malicious story. He told them I had grown violently paranoid. He claimed I was hallucinating affairs and locking myself in my home office for days on end, muttering to myself. He told the most powerful men in the city that I had committed corporate sabotage in a fit of absolute feminine hysteria, stealing company funds before fleeing like a common criminal. He portrayed himself as the stoic, courageous captain trying to keep the sterling heritage ship afloat while his deranged wife tried to sink it. The wealthy wives of his colleagues quickly spread the poison through the tennis courts and the luxury spa. The whispers moved like a raging wildfire, burning through the dry brush of high society gossip. Poor Richard, they murmured over their organic salads and sparkling water. Can you imagine the terrible humiliation of dealing with a crazy wife? I always thought she was a little too quiet, a little too obsessed with those boring ledgers. It is the absolute tragedy, really. He gave her such a beautiful, lavish life, and she repays him by stealing his money and running away like a lunatic. They clucked their tongues and cast their harsh judgments, completely oblivious to the fact that the man they were pitying was a serial adulterer and a corporate embezzler who had planned to lock his perfectly sane wife in a psychiatric ward just to steal her money. My phone began to vibrate constantly. The screen lit up with dozens of text messages and voicemails from the very people who were currently tearing my name to shreds. They were fake messages of concern wrapped tightly in layers of hypocritical curiosity. "Oh, Rebecca, sweetheart, I heard the terrible news. Please call me back. We just want to get you some help." Another message read, "Rebecca, we are praying for your mental health. Please come home to Richard. He's absolutely devastated without you." I sat on my sofa staring at the glowing screen. The absolute betrayal by my community stung deeply. These were people I had hosted in my home for nearly 30 years. These were women I had comforted during their own personal crises. Yet the exact moment Richard spun his web of lies, they blindly believed the charismatic man in the expensive suit over the quiet woman who had actually done all the hard work. They dismissed my entire lifetime of impeccable character simply because the charming CEO told them I was crazy. It was a harsh, isolating reality. I was completely alone, cast out from my own social circle, branded as a thief and a lunatic. The isolation was specifically meant to break me. Richard knew that most women of my age and social standing would crumble under the heavy weight of such massive public humiliation. He expected me to panic. He expected me to call him sobbing and begging him to clear my name. He expected me to trade my master passwords and my founding shares just to stop the vicious rumors and return to my comfortable life. But he fundamentally misunderstood the core of my being. I did not care about the country club luncheons. I did not care about the fake smiles of hypocritical neighbors. I only cared about the truth and the ultimate execution of undeniable justice. I turned my phone on silent and tossed it onto the coffee table. The buzzing stopped. The silence in my apartment was not lonely. It was the deeply focused quiet of a sniper waiting patiently for the absolute perfect shot. On Thursday morning, I drove back to the downtown district to meet with Harrison. The Texas heat was already blistering, radiating aggressively off the concrete pavement as I walked into the towering glass skyscraper. The air conditioning in Harrison's office was turned up high, providing a stark physical contrast to the boiling temperature outside. Harrison was pacing fiercely behind his sleek glass desk, his jaw clenched tightly. He had a thick stack of printed emails and social media posts spread out across the table. He looked up as I entered, his eyes burning with a fierce protective anger. "Have you seen what he is doing?" "Rebecca." Harrison demanded, his deep voice echoing loudly in the large office. "He has gone on a complete media blitz within your social circles. He's telling every single investor, every board member, and every bank manager that you are suffering from acute schizophrenia. He's setting the narrative perfectly. He's preparing the ground to officially file for emergency medical conservatorship. He wants the board to vote you out in absentia based on total medical incompetence." I walked over to the heavy leather guest chair and sat down, crossing my legs smoothly. I placed my tote bag on the floor, projecting absolute calm. "I have seen the church broadcast Harrison. I have seen the text messages. He's playing his part exactly as I anticipated." Harrison stopped pacing and stared at me, clearly frustrated by my lack of visible outrage. "Rebecca, we cannot just sit here and let him destroy your reputation like this. We need to strike back immediately. I have a contact at the Dallas Business Journal. We can leak the offshore account routing numbers today. We can release the text messages between him and Ashley. We can show the world that he is the fraud and the criminal. If we do not counter his smear campaign right now, the board might actually believe his lies and vote to strip your administrative powers. We need to defend you publicly right now." I looked at the printed papers on the desk. They were filled with vicious, terrible lies, calling me unstable, greedy, and insane. A younger version of me would have cried. A weaker version of me would have rushed to a microphone to clear my name. But the woman sitting in that chair was forged in the fire of absolute betrayal. I looked up at Harrison, my gaze as sharp and cold as a surgical scalpel. I shook my head slowly. "No, Harrison." I said, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We will not leak a single document to the press. We will not engage in a petty public shouting match with a desperate man." Harrison frowned, leaning his heavy hands on the glass desk. "Why? He is assassinating your character. He is making you look like an absolute monster to people you have known for decades. Because right now, he's entirely focused on his own performance." I explained, my voice remarkably steady and completely devoid of emotion. "He thinks he's winning. He thinks because the country club wives are crying for him and the church elders are praying for him that he has successfully cornered me. He is wasting his time and his very limited energy putting on a massive theatrical show while his bank accounts remain completely frozen. He is bleeding out Harrison, and he is using his last breaths to sing his own praises." I stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looking down at the tiny cars moving through the busy city streets below. When you fight a narcissist, you do not interrupt their grand soliloquy. You let them talk. You let them build their glorious stage. You let them gather their entire audience. I turned back to face my oldest friend and lawyer. Let him climb higher on his pedestal of lies. I stated, my voice resonating with a terrifying, lethal authority. The fall will break every bone in his ego. Harrison stared at me for a long, heavy moment, the aggressive tension in his broad shoulders slowly melting away. A slow, calculating smile crept across his face as he realized the sheer absolute brutality of my strategy. You want him to feel completely victorious right up until the exact second we drop the guillotine. "Exactly," I replied, walking back to the chair and sitting down. If we leak the documents to the media now, he will have time to invent a complicated excuse. He will claim the offshore accounts were for legitimate corporate tax purposes. He will claim Ashley is just a disgruntled employee trying to ruin him. He will use his endless charm to twist the narrative and drag this out in the media for months. But if we let him call the emergency board meeting, if we let him gather all the stakeholders in one room to formally declare me insane, that is when we strike. We do not fight him in the newspapers. We execute him in the boardroom in front of the very people he has been lying to all week. Harrison nodded slowly, a profound, deep respect shining in his eyes. He picked up his gold fountain pen and tapped it thoughtfully against the glass desk. He has scheduled the emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He sent out the formal notices yesterday evening. The agenda specifically cites a vote to transfer your founding shares into a temporary corporate receivership due to your unverified medical absence. He is bringing Ashley with him to present the forged psychiatric evaluations directly to the general partners. My heart gave a single hard thump against my ribs, but it was not from fear or anxiety. It was the pure adrenaline thrill of the impending strike. The trap was perfectly set. Richard had eagerly, joyfully walked right into the center of the kill zone. "Is the documentation regarding the Heritage Vanguard Trust fully prepared?" I asked, keeping my tone strictly professional. Harrison opened a secure drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy binder bound in dark leather. "It is completely bulletproof, Rebecca. I have the original notarized trust establishment, forms the corporate charter amendments, and the supermajority voting authorizations. I also have the signed confession from his brother regarding the wire fraud and the complete digital log of his offshore transfers to Ashley's shell company. We have absolutely everything we need to legally terminate him, seize the assets, and turn him over to the federal authorities." I reached out and rested my hand on the heavy leather binder. The weight of it felt incredibly satisfying. This was my life's work, fully weaponized and ready to fire. "Good," I said softly. "Let him spend tonight celebrating with his mistress. Let him practice his sad victim speech in the bathroom mirror. Tomorrow morning, we are going to walk into that boardroom and remind him exactly who owns the empire he is trying to steal." The morning sun reflected fiercely off the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Dallas as I pulled my modest sedan into the underground parking garage of the city's most ruthless corporate law firm. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet darkness of the concrete structure for a brief moment. Bailey rested quietly in the back seat, his golden fur soft and comforting. I cracked the windows for him and promised I would return shortly. I grabbed the heavy leather tote bag sitting on the passenger seat. Inside the bag rested the 4 encrypted solid-state hard drives containing the complete financial anatomy of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. My heart was no longer pounding with the frantic, terrified rhythm of a betrayed wife. It was beating with the slow, measured, and lethal pulse of a woman preparing for war. I walked into the polished marble lobby of the firm and rode the silent high-speed elevator to the 42nd floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of dark mahogany and brushed steel designed specifically to make opposing counsel feel small. The receptionist greeted me immediately and escorted me down a long, quiet corridor to a massive corner office. Harrison was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Texas cityscape. He was a tall, imposing man in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. Harrison and I had met over 30 years ago, during our freshman year in the accounting program at the University of Texas. We had spent countless late nights studying corporate tax law and dissecting complex financial models. He eventually pivoted to corporate litigation, becoming one of the most feared and brilliant corporate attorneys in the state. He was a shark in the courtroom known for dismantling hostile takeovers and crushing fraudulent executives without a single ounce of mercy. More importantly, Harrison was the only person in my life who had never been fooled by my husband. From the very day I introduced them decades ago, Harrison had looked straight through Richard's charming, charismatic facade. He had warned me back then that Richard was a man built entirely on vanity and reckless ambition. I was too young and too blindly in love to listen. Harrison turned away from the window as the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me. His sharp, observant eyes scanned my face, immediately registering the complete absence of my diamond wedding ring and the cold, unnatural stillness in my posture. He walked over to his sleek glass desk and poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe. He did not offer any meaningless platitudes or fake sympathy. He simply pushed a cup across the desk toward me and sat down. "You finally saw the man behind the curtain," Harrison said, his deep voice completely devoid of judgment. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. I pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out the 4 heavy metal hard drives, placing them squarely in the center of his pristine glass desk. The solid thud of the metal hitting the glass echoed loudly in the quiet office. "He is not just a fraud, Harrison," I said, my voice perfectly level and chilled to the bone. "He is a predator, and he is currently planning to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility so he can legally strip me of my founding shares and run away with a 30-year-old acquisitions director." Harrison froze with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Even for a man who spent his entire career dealing with the darkest corners of corporate greed, the sheer depravity of Richard's plan was staggering. He slowly lowered his cup, his jaw clenching so tightly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. A dangerous predatory darkness settled over his eyes. "Tell me everything," Harrison commanded, pulling a fresh legal pad from his drawer and picking up a gold fountain pen. I did not shed a single tear as I recounted the events of the previous night. I spoke with the clinical, detached precision of a forensic auditor presenting a criminal dossier. I told him about the hushed conversation I overheard behind the rose bushes at the country club. I detailed the exact routing numbers Richard was using to siphon our corporate operating funds into the offshore shell company registered in his mistress's name. I explained the dead man's switch I had activated before walking out of the house, leaving Richard completely locked out of his own financial architecture. Finally, I described the fabricated medical evaluations Richard had purchased from a corrupt country club psychiatrist meant to declare me legally insane. Harrison wrote furiously, filling 3 pages of the legal pad with rapid, sharp strokes. When I finished speaking, the silence in the vast office was heavy and thick with tension. Harrison let out a slow, deep breath, tossing his pen onto the desk. He wants to use an emergency medical power of attorney to bypass family court and seize your 50% stake in the company, Harrison stated, his mind already rapidly processing the legal angles. It is a vile strategy, but tragically effective if he manages to get a judge to sign the commitment order before you realize what is happening. By the time you proved your sanity, the corporate accounts would be permanently drained. I took a slow sip of the bitter black coffee, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus. "He assumes I am a weak, obedient workhorse who will just roll over and disappear," I said. "He thinks he can lock me and steal my entire life's work." Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass desk. He looked at me with a fierce protective loyalty that had survived 3 decades of friendship. "We are going to hit him with the most aggressive divorce petition this state has ever seen, Rebecca. I will file an emergency injunction to freeze every single personal and corporate asset tied to his name. I will have the court tear apart that offshore shell company, and we will file criminal fraud charges against that corrupt psychiatrist before noon tomorrow. Richard wants a war. We will give him a slaughter." I placed my hand flat on the glass desk, stopping him. I shook my head slowly. The icy resolve in my chest solidified into a diamond-hard core. "No, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "We are not going to file for a standard divorce. A divorce is exactly what he is preparing to fight. If we take this to family court, he will drag it out for years. He will hide behind his high-priced defense attorneys, and he will use the company's remaining revenue to bleed me dry in legal fees. I do not want a divorce settlement. I do not want half of the assets. I want his empire." Harrison frowned, leaning back in his leather chair. His sharp mind analyzed my words, searching for the logic. "Rebecca, you own exactly 50% of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. The corporate charter requires a majority board vote to force a leadership change. Even if we prove his embezzlement in civil court, removing him as chief executive officer without a clear voting majority will be a massive uphill battle." I reached out and placed my index finger on the top hard drive sitting on the desk. "That is where you are wrong, Harrison," I said softly. "I want you to go back 12 years. Do you remember the catastrophic failure of the Riverfront Commercial Plaza project?" Harrison narrowed his eyes, nodding slowly. "I remember it clearly. The primary structural contractor went bankrupt halfway through the build. A massive group of investors filed a $50 million class action lawsuit against Sterling Heritage for gross negligence and breach of contract. Richard was absolutely terrified. He thought he was going to lose the company, his personal wealth, and face federal prison time. He was terrified because he knew he was personally liable, I explained smoothly. He had illegally bypassed several zoning regulations to speed up the construction process. When the lawsuit hit his desk, he came to me sobbing like a frightened child. He begged me to use my financial expertise to shield our personal assets from the impending litigation. He needed a legal firewall to ensure that even if the investors won the lawsuit, they could not seize the core holding company. I leaned closer to Harrison, holding his gaze with absolute unwavering certainty. I built that firewall for him. I created an incredibly complex corporate structure called the Heritage Vanguard Trust. It was designed as an irrevocable blind trust. I drafted the legal documents transferring 60% of the primary voting shares of Sterling Heritage directly into that trust, thereby insulating the majority ownership from any personal litigation aimed at Richard. Harrison stared at me, his brilliant legal mind racing as he began to piece the puzzle together. Richard signed those transfer documents, Harrison asked, his voice tight with rising anticipation. He signed every single page. I replied, a cold, triumphant smile curving the corners of my lips. He was in such a frantic state of panic that he never even read the fine print. He just wanted the assets protected from the investors. He assumed the blind trust was managed by an anonymous third-party financial institution. He thought it was just a temporary legal shield that he could eventually dissolve once the lawsuit was settled out of court. But he never dissolved it, Harrison said, leaning forward, his eyes widening with realization. No, he did not, I confirmed. The lawsuit dragged on for 3 years before we finally settled. By the time it was over, Richard had completely forgotten about the internal share transfer. The company exploded in growth, and his ego grew right along with it. He spent the next decade parading around the country club, believing he was the undisputed king of a massive real estate empire. He never once looked at the foundational corporate charter again. Harrison stared at the encrypted hard drives sitting on his desk, as if they were solid bars of gold. He looked back up at me, a predatory, highly dangerous smile spreading across his face. Rebecca, who is the named trustee of the Heritage Vanguard Trust. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, projecting the absolute calm of a woman who held the world in her palm. The trust documents explicitly state that the sole irrevocable trustee holding absolute voting authority over those shares is me. The silence in the sleek glass office was absolute. Harrison let out a low, sharp breath of pure astonishment. The implications of what I had just revealed hung in the air, shifting the entire balance of power in a single heartbeat. Richard does not own the company, Harrison whispered, a profound sense of awe dripping from his words. He has not owned the majority share in over a decade. The 50% stake you hold jointly is totally meaningless because the Heritage Vanguard Trust holds the supermajority. Those are ghost shares to the public, but they are entirely legally binding. You own 60% of the voting power. Richard is nothing but a minority shareholder. He is literally just an employee working for his own wife. Exactly, I said, my voice ringing with lethal finality. He thinks I am an invisible workhorse. He thinks I have been sitting in the dark entirely powerless while he builds his fortune. He has no idea that every time he sat at the head of that boardroom table, he was only there because I silently allowed it. And now I am revoking my permission. Harrison threw his head back and let out a rich, booming laugh that filled the large office. It was the laugh of a courtroom shark who had just been handed the most perfect, flawless weapon imaginable. He grabbed his gold fountain pen and pulled the legal pad back toward him, flipping immediately to a fresh page. "We are not filing for divorce," Rebecca Harrison said, his eyes shining with a ruthless, calculating fire. "We are executing a corporate hostile takeover from the inside." He began writing furiously, mapping out the strategic sequence. "We do not need a family court judge to divide the assets. You already own the controlling interest. We are going to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors. We will officially reveal the existence of the Heritage Vanguard Trust to the general partners. We will present the digital evidence of his gross fiduciary negligence, his systematic embezzlement, and his attempts to defraud the company through his mistress's shell corporation. And then I added my voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's blade. I will use my supermajority voting power to unilaterally terminate his employment as Chief Executive Officer for cause. We will completely strip him of his corporate access, his company vehicles, his expense accounts, and his public dignity. Harrison looked up from his legal pad, his expression hardening into an intimidating mask of professional brutality. When he tries to fight back, when he tries to claim the trust transfer was fraudulent, we will bury him in his own signed documents. And the moment he is officially terminated, we hand over the entire red folder of his tax evasion and offshore embezzlement directly to the federal authorities. He will not just leave the building unemployed. He will leave the building in handcuffs. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Texas city below. The morning sun was climbing higher, illuminating the concrete canyons where Richard had built his empire of lies. He had spent his entire morning screaming at his IT department, completely panicked over his locked bank accounts and frozen funds. He thought that was the extent of his problems. He thought it was just a temporary digital glitch holding up his new life with Ashley. He had absolutely no idea that a massive legal and corporate tsunami was rapidly forming right above his head. He had treated my devotion as a weakness. He had laughed behind the rose bushes and claimed my dog deserved more love than I did. I was going to ensure that by the time this week was over, he would be begging for the kind of shelter my dog enjoyed. "Draft the corporate termination papers, Harrison," I said, standing up and smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. "Ensure every single legal loophole is completely sealed shut. I want the board meeting scheduled for this Friday. Let him sweat over his frozen accounts for a few days. Let him feel the terrifying loss of control." Harrison stood up, matching my steely resolve. "It will be an absolute massacre, Rebecca. I have never seen a trap this perfectly laid. I will have my team assemble the corporate notices immediately." I picked up my leather tote bag and turned toward the heavy glass door. I was no longer the heartbroken woman hiding on the country club terrace. I was the architect, and I was finally coming to reclaim my house. The silent exit was over. The loud, devastating collapse of his empire was about to begin. I sat in the dim quiet of my temporary apartment, watching the glow of my laptop screen illuminate the dark room. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft, steady rhythm of my own breathing and the occasional sigh from my golden retriever Bailey, who was sleeping soundly at my feet. For the past 3 days, I had been monitoring the digital heartbeat of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. Through the administrative backdoors I had carefully woven into the servers years ago, I was able to watch every frantic, uncoordinated move my husband made. He was a man trapped in a burning building of his own design, constantly pulling on locked doors and screaming at the flames. But tonight my focus was not on Richard. A true forensic auditor knows that the weakest link in any fraudulent conspiracy is never the mastermind. The weakest link is always the parasite feeding off the host. I shifted my attention away from the blocked corporate accounts and focused entirely on Ashley. Ashley was 30 years old with a highly expensive taste for imported leather goods and exotic vacations. She had built her entire reality around the promise of Richard's stolen wealth. For the past 8 months, she had enjoyed the limitless luxury of Crimson Acquisitions. This was the offshore shell company Richard had funded with my hard-earned money. He had bled our operating accounts dry to give her a life of endless privilege. But now that well was completely dry. I had tracked her digital footprint over the last 48 hours with intense fascination. Her corporate credit cards had been systematically declined at luxury boutiques and expensive downtown day spas. I watched the automated network alerts roll in as she repeatedly attempted to book first-class flights to Paris, only to be flatly rejected by the banking portal. I could practically feel her mounting rage vibrating through the screen. A woman like Ashley does not stay loyal when the money stops flowing. She demands immediate satisfaction and constant adoration. When the golden goose stops laying eggs, the parasite will inevitably try to slaughter the bird to get what is inside. I knew she was getting incredibly desperate. I knew she would make a careless mistake. I just had to be patient and wait for her to step right into the snare. The alert came at exactly 2 a.m. A soft, gentle chime from my laptop signaled that someone was attempting to access the Crimson Acquisitions administrative portal. I sat up straight, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My heart beat with a slow, cold rhythm. I traced the IP address instantly. It was located in a high-end residential building downtown. It was Ashley. She was logging in using her secondary credentials. I had intentionally left a tiny digital window open for her, just wide enough to let her slip her hand inside, but narrow enough to trap her wrist permanently. I watched her screen in real time through my secure remote viewing software. She navigated past the frozen primary accounts and headed straight for the corporate dissolution directory. She was trying to liquidate the entire shell company. She wanted to cash out the remaining physical assets and transfer the remaining liquid capital into a private, untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. It was a bold, greedy, and incredibly stupid move. To liquidate a corporate entity of that size, she needed the primary authorization signature from the chief executive officer. She needed Richard to sign off on the dissolution. But Richard was completely locked out of the system. He could not help her even if he wanted to. I watched the cursor blink rapidly on her screen as she hesitated. The system prompted her for the digital authorization signature. I held my breath, waiting to see just how far her blind greed would push her. Would she call Richard and demand he fix it? Or would she take matters into her own perfectly manicured hands? The answer came a few short seconds later. Ashley opened a secondary application and uploaded a high-resolution scan of Richard's actual signature. She had obviously stolen it from a previous legal contract they had worked on together. She carefully cropped the image and pasted it directly onto the digital liquidation forms. She was forging a federal corporate document to steal millions of dollars. She was committing felony wire fraud right in front of my eyes. A cold, deeply satisfying smile spread across my face. She clicked submit. The system processed the forged document, logging the IP address, the timestamp, and the exact nature of the fraud. She thought she had just won the lottery. She probably poured herself a glass of champagne, believing she was about to become a millionaire. She had no idea that I had programmed the portal to hold the transfer in a hidden pending state. The money was never going to move, but the digital footprint she just created was permanent, undeniable, and completely damning. I immediately went to work. I downloaded the entire sequence of her fraudulent actions. I pulled the forged signature files, the cryptocurrency wallet routing numbers, and the timestamped login logs. I placed them into a secure red digital folder on my desktop. But Ashley was just the appetizer. It was time to serve the main course. I opened the master ledger containing every single detail of Richard's massive tax evasion scheme. I had spent years quietly archiving his hidden offshore transfers, his inflated vendor invoices, and his illegal corporate write-offs. He always thought my meticulous record-keeping was just a boring hobby. He never realized I was building an impenetrable cage around him. I combined everything into one massive encrypted dossier. I navigated to the official whistleblower portal for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The federal website loaded with a stark bureaucratic interface. I filled out the secure forms with absolute clinical precision. I did not leave a single loophole or a single unanswered question. I uploaded the red folder containing Ashley's blatant wire fraud and Richard's extensive tax evasion. I provided the names, the dates, the routing numbers, and the exact physical locations of the frozen offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I detailed how Richard used Crimson Acquisitions as a vehicle to hide stolen assets and avoid federal taxes. I attached the forged psychiatric evaluations he planned to use against me, proving his malicious intent to commit fraud. I sat back in my chair and took a deep, long breath. I felt the immense crushing weight of the last 28 years lifting from my shoulders. The years of staying quiet, the years of managing his monumental ego, the years of balancing the books while he took all the credit. It was all finally coming to an end. I moved the cursor over the final submission button. I clicked submit. The upload progress bar filled the screen, turning a bright solid green as the files were securely transmitted to the federal authorities. The trap had officially snapped shut. There was no going back. The federal government now possessed the complete, undeniable blueprint of Richard's criminal empire. The Internal Revenue Service does not play games. They do not care about country club memberships or charming smiles. They only care about the numbers, and the numbers I had just given them were devastating. While I was sealing their fate with the federal government, Richard was desperately trying to build a raft out of rotten wood. Through my network monitoring, I saw that he had been busy making frantic phone calls and sending encrypted emails to private lenders. His traditional banking avenues were completely blocked by my dead man switch. He could not access a single corporate dime to keep his business afloat. But Richard was a creature of immense pride, and he completely refused to admit defeat. He had reached out to a shadowy private equity contact he had met years ago at a charity golf tournament, a man who specialized in high-interest, unrecorded bridge loans for desperate executives. I watched the emails bounce back and forth between them. Richard was leveraging the Sterling Heritage corporate headquarters building as collateral for a massive $10 million short-term loan. He needed the cash to satisfy his angry investors, pay his immediate vendors, and keep the doors open just long enough to execute his plan to remove me at the upcoming board meeting. He was acting like a wounded animal, thrashing blindly in the dark. Richard actually believed he had found a lifeline. He believed his natural charisma had saved him once again. He sent a confident, arrogant email to his private lawyer, boasting that the temporary funding problem was entirely solved. He demanded that the medical power of attorney documents be fully finalized and ready for Friday morning. He was sitting in his grand office, completely blind to the horrific reality of his situation. He thought the bridge loan would save his empire. He did not realize that because the Heritage Vanguard Trust held the supermajority of voting shares, any loan he secured using company property as collateral, without my explicit authorization, was entirely fraudulent and legally void. He was just adding massive bank fraud to his rapidly growing list of federal crimes. He was digging his own grave deeper and deeper with every single arrogant move he made. I read his confident emails and felt a strange sense of pity mixed with my cold resolve. He was so completely detached from reality. He had spent his entire life believing his own lies, believing that he was untouchable. He thought he was the brilliant mastermind who had outsmarted his boring, invisible wife. He thought his Friday board meeting was going to be his ultimate triumph, where he would publicly declare me insane and take total control of my life. He had no idea that I had already handed his entire life over to the federal authorities. He had no idea that Ashley had just handed the government a perfectly documented case of wire fraud. The noose was tightening around his neck with every passing hour, and he was happily tying the knot himself. I closed my laptop and rested my hands on the cool metal casing. The sun was beginning to rise outside my window, casting a soft pink glow over the quiet city streets. A new day was starting. The final pieces of the board were perfectly aligned. Richard had his fake loan. Ashley had her fake cryptocurrency transfer. They were both resting on a foundation of absolute sand. I stood up and walked into the small kitchen to pour myself a cup of coffee. Bailey followed me, wagging his tail and pressing his warm head against my leg. I reached down and stroked his soft fur, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. The storm was no longer approaching. The storm was already here, and Richard was standing right in the center of the lightning strike, holding a metal rod. I smiled, taking a sip of the bitter, dark coffee. Friday morning was going to be an absolute revelation. The hours ticked by slowly as I monitored the final preparations for the board meeting. Harrison had his legal team working around the clock, ensuring every single document regarding the Heritage Vanguard Trust was perfectly prepared and ready for presentation. We had the original signed transfer documents, the corporate charter amendments, and the supermajority voting authorizations. We were fully armed and ready for the slaughter. Richard continued his charade throughout the day. He walked through the office projecting false confidence, assuring his staff that the network issues were just a temporary glitch and that a massive influx of capital was arriving soon. He held closed-door meetings with his cronies, spreading more lies about my mental health. He was completely consumed by his own performance. He loved the attention, he loved the sympathy, and he loved the feeling of absolute power. I watched him through the security cameras, playing the role of the tragic hero. It was a masterful performance, I had to admit. If I did not know the truth, I might have believed him myself. But I knew the monster hiding behind the charm. I knew the man who had planned to lock me away in a cold, sterile room for the rest of my life, just so he could sleep with a younger woman. As Thursday evening approached, the tension in my apartment grew thick and heavy. Tomorrow was the day of reckoning. Tomorrow, I would walk into that boardroom and look my husband in the eye. I would strip away his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom in front of the entire company. I would reveal the truth about the Heritage Vanguard Trust and claim my rightful place as the sole owner of Sterling Heritage Real Estate. I packed my leather tote bag with the encrypted hard drives, the printed ledgers, and the trust documents. I chose a sharp-tailored navy blue suit for the meeting. It was a suit that commanded respect and projected absolute authority. I was not going to hide in the shadows anymore. I was going to step into the light and burn his kingdom to the ground. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind raced with the anticipation of the final confrontation. I thought about the 28 years I had spent loving a man who never truly loved me. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had put on hold, the silent tears I had cried. All of it had led to this exact moment. The pain of his betrayal was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning desire for absolute justice. I was going to make him pay for every single lie, every single insult, and every single stolen dollar. I was going to show him the true strength of the woman he had underestimated for nearly 3 decades. Friday morning arrived with a clear, bright sky. I stood in front of the mirror, taking a final look at my reflection. My eyes were clear and sharp. My posture was straight and unyielding. The invisible workhorse was gone. The architect had arrived. I picked up my tote bag, gave Bailey a quick kiss on the head, and walked out the door ready to end the war. I walked out to my modest dark grey sedan, the morning air feeling crisp and full of absolute promise. The drive downtown was smooth, the traffic flowing easily, as if the city itself was making way for the execution I was about to deliver. I kept the radio off, preferring the quiet hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of my own thoughts. I replayed the entire sequence of events in my mind, from the horrific discovery at the country club to the moment I clicked submit on the federal whistleblower portal. It felt like a lifetime had passed in just a few short days. Richard was likely already at the office, drinking his expensive coffee and reviewing his forged medical documents. He would be surrounded by his loyal sycophants, ready to formally vote me out of my own company. He was probably wearing his best power suit, practicing his fake sad face for the board of directors. The sheer arrogance required to steal a woman's life and then invite an audience to watch the final act was staggering. But his arrogance was exactly what made him so incredibly blind. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the Sterling Heritage Building, taking a spot far away from the executive elevators. I did not want Richard or his people to see my car before the meeting began. I gathered my heavy leather bag, feeling the solid weight of the evidence inside. Every printed page, every encrypted drive was a bullet aimed directly at Richard's heart. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The metal doors slid shut, enclosing me in a quiet upward ascent. I closed my eyes and took one last deep centering breath. The soft ding of the elevator bell announced my arrival at the executive level. The doors slowly opened, revealing the plush, familiar carpet and the sleek glass walls of the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I stepped out of the elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she recognized me. I did not smile, and I did not say a word. I simply kept walking straight toward the heavy double doors of the main boardroom. The time for hiding was completely over. The time for absolute ruin had finally begun. The executive boardroom of Sterling Heritage Real Estate was a massive cavernous space constructed of thick frosted glass and polished dark mahogany. It sat proudly on the 42nd floor of the skyscraper, offering a commanding, sweeping view of the sunlit Dallas skyline. Richard stood at the head of the incredibly long conference table, perfectly framed by the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal power suit that screamed absolute control and unearned authority. Beside him stood Ashley, wearing a tight red designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a serious corporate meeting. She had one perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on the back of Richard's heavy leather chair, projecting the smug, confident aura of a woman who fully believed she was about to be crowned the new queen of the empire. The 12 senior members of the board of directors sat around the table murmuring in hushed, solemn tones. They were the most powerful investors and real estate developers in the state. Richard raised his hand slowly, demanding absolute silence from the room. He lowered his head, adopting a sickeningly perfect mask of a devastated, heartbroken husband. He spoke in a soft, trembling voice, telling the board that his beloved wife Rebecca had suffered a complete and catastrophic mental breakdown. He lied effortlessly, claiming I had drained our personal accounts in a fit of paranoid delusion and vanished into the night. He handed out glossy printed copies of the forged psychiatric evaluations, shaking his silver head in mock despair. He told the board that for the financial survival of the company, they had to immediately pass a motion to transfer my founding shares into a temporary corporate receivership under his sole unilateral control. He was standing there, just minutes away from legally stealing my entire life. Just as the senior board member raised his hand to initiate the formal voting process, the heavy frosted glass double doors of the boardroom swung open with a massive resounding crash. The entire room fell into absolute dead silence. I stepped over the threshold, and the temperature in the room instantly plummeted to freezing. I was no longer wearing the conservative, frumpy cardigans and boring slacks Richard always forced me to wear to keep me invisible. I wore a flawless, tailored white power suit that radiated sharp, undeniable authority and cold sophistication. My posture was perfectly straight, my head held high, and my gaze was as cold and piercing as a winter storm. Right beside my leg, walking with perfect calm obedience, was Bailey, my golden retriever. And flanking my right side, holding a thick leather briefcase, was Harrison, the most feared corporate litigator in the entire state of Texas. The shock on Richard's face was an absolute masterpiece of human terror. All the fake blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost facing his own executioner. Ashley stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as she let out a pathetic squeaking gasp. The 12 board members stared at me in total, complete bewilderment. I walked slowly and deliberately down the length of the long mahogany table. The only sound in the cavernous room was the sharp, confident click of my heels and the soft padding of my dog's paws against the expensive carpet. Security! Richard suddenly screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. Somebody call security down here right now and get this crazy woman out of my building. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger at me, his carefully constructed, charismatic facade completely shattering into a million pathetic pieces. Sit down, Richard, I commanded. My voice did not shake. It did not rise to a loud, hysterical shout. It was a smooth, lethal whisper that cut through the cavernous boardroom like a physical surgical blade. I walked straight to the digital projection console at the center of the table. I pulled a sleek, encrypted solid-state drive from my suit pocket and plugged it directly into the main terminal. You have absolutely no right to be here, Richard yelled, slamming his heavy fists onto the table. You are medically unfit. You are completely insane. Harrison stepped forward, placing his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished wood. Gentlemen of the board, Harrison said, his deep, resonant voice filling the room with undeniable legal authority. My client, Rebecca Sterling, is entirely of sound mind. Any medical document presented to you today by that man is a complete and utter criminal fabrication. In fact, we have already forwarded those forged psychiatric evaluations to the federal authorities, along with a formal felony complaint against the corrupt doctor who signed them. A collective loud gasp rippled through the seated board members. I did not waste a single second, letting them recover from the shock. I pressed a button on the console, and the massive digital screen behind Richard flared to life. The first document to appear was not a medical file. It was a highly detailed forensic financial ledger. Since my husband wants to talk about the financial survival of this company, I think we should look at where the corporate funds have actually been going. I announced, my eyes locking onto Richard like a predator. The screen displayed dozens of high-level wire transfers, systematically siphoning millions of dollars from our primary operating accounts directly into a newly registered shell company called Crimson Acquisitions. I clicked the next slide, projecting the state registration documents for Crimson Acquisitions. The sole managing director, listed in bold black letters, was Ashley. The board members began to murmur loudly, shifting angrily in their expensive leather chairs. As the undeniable Mathematical proof of embezzlement glared down at them. Ashley shrank back against the glass wall, looking frantically at Richard for protection. But Richard was completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing silently. I was just getting started with my digital execution. I clicked the console again, bringing up a high-resolution scan of a heavily notarized document. The room grew deathly quiet as the board members read the text. It was a formal, legally binding confession, signed and dated by Richard's own brother, Thomas. "This is a sworn affidavit from Thomas Sterling," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. It details a massive systemic wire fraud operation conducted over the past 3 years. Thomas admits to using this company's name to defraud vendors and illegally secure private loans. More importantly, this document proves that Richard was entirely aware of these federal felonies and actively covered them up using corporate revenue to pay off his brother's massive gambling debts. "Lies!" Richard sputtered, sweat pouring profusely down his forehead and stinging his eyes. "These are all fabricated lies. She hacked the system. She is trying to destroy me because she is mentally unstable. Do not listen to a single word this lunatic says." I ignored his pathetic, frantic whining entirely. I kept my eyes completely fixed on the senior board members who were now staring at Richard with open, unadulterated disgust. I had saved the absolute most devastating piece of evidence for the grand finale. I pressed the button one final time. The massive screen shifted, displaying a complex web of corporate ownership charts and a scanned copy of an original establishing charter. The official seal of the state of Texas was clearly visible at the bottom of the page. For the past 12 years, Richard has sat at the head of this table, pretending to be the undisputed king of Sterling Heritage real estate. I said, my voice ringing with absolute pure clarity. But as you can all clearly see on the screen, Richard signed away his controlling interest over a decade ago to protect himself from a massive class action lawsuit. He transferred 60% of the primary voting shares into an irrevocable blind trust called the Heritage Vanguard Trust. I paused, letting the massive magnitude of that statement settle over the room. I watched as the senior legal counsel for the board furiously read the projected documents, his eyes widening in absolute terrifying shock. Richard assumed that trust was just a temporary shield. I continued folding my hands neatly in front of me. He was too arrogant and too lazy to read the fine print. If he had, he would have realized that the sole irrevocable trustee holding absolute voting authority over those shares is me. The silence in the boardroom was incredibly heavy and absolute. It was the sound of an entire corporate empire shifting its balance of power in a single devastating heartbeat. Richard stared at the screen, his face completely devoid of color. He finally realized the absolute monumental scale of his own stupidity. The ghost shares he thought he had hidden away were real, and they were currently wrapped tightly around his throat. "You do not own this company, Richard," I said, looking directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "You are a minority shareholder. You are nothing but an employee. And as the legal entity holding the 60% supermajority voting power, I'm officially calling this emergency meeting to order." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His legs gave way, and he collapsed heavily into his leather chair, looking like a broken, deflated balloon. Ashley let out a loud, quiet sob, realizing her entire future of endless luxury had just been incinerated in front of a live audience. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The naive, loyal wife who had spent 28 years blindly protecting this man was dead and buried. I looked out at the 12 board members who were now looking at me with profound, deep respect and a very healthy dose of fear. As the controlling shareholder, I am executing an immediate unilateral motion. I announced, my voice cold and hard as a diamond. Effective this exact second, Richard Sterling is permanently terminated as Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Heritage Real Estate for gross fiduciary negligence, systematic embezzlement, and corporate fraud. I turned my gaze back to Richard, delivering the final fatal blow. You are completely stripped of all corporate access. You are stripped of your company vehicles and your lavish expense accounts. Security will escort you and your mistress out of my building immediately. And when you reach the lobby, you will find 2 federal agents waiting for you with a red folder containing the entire history of your offshore tax evasion. Harrison stepped forward, snapping his briefcase shut with a sharp, definitive click. The execution was completely flawless. The corporate hostile takeover was an absolute total success. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my golden retriever sitting calmly by my side, and I finally took my rightful place as the absolute master of the empire I had built. Women can sacrifice for love, but we should never ever be foolish. When you are backed into a corner and betrayed by the person you trusted most, do not cry and do not scream. Show them your true undeniable strength and let karma deliver the absolute destruction they deserve. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what time it is, where you are watching this video, and where you are from in the comments below. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom seemed to vibrate with the sheer weight of the absolute silence inside the room. Richard stood completely frozen at the head of the long conference table. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound managed to escape his throat. The charismatic, highly polished facade he had worn for nearly 3 decades was completely gone. In its place was nothing but the raw, terrified face of a man who realized his entire kingdom was built on absolute sand. The 12 senior board members, who had just minutes ago listened to his fake, tragic stories about my mental health, were now staring at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. They were some of the most powerful and ruthless investors in the state of Texas, and they absolutely despised being played for fools. The digital evidence of his massive wire fraud and offshore embezzlement was still glowing brightly on the large presentation screen behind him. It was a giant, undeniable monument to his breathtaking greed. Richard looked frantically around the massive frosted glass room, searching for a single friendly face. He looked at his senior legal counsel, but the man had already turned his chair away, refusing to even make eye contact. He looked at the investors who had funded his lavish lifestyle, but they were busy packing their expensive leather briefcases, eager to distance themselves from the toxic radioactive fallout of a federal crime. Richard was completely alone. He had spent his entire life using people as stepping stones to elevate his own massive ego. And now there was absolutely no one left to catch him when he finally fell. The isolation he had planned to inflict on me by locking me away in a psychiatric ward was now wrapping its cold, heavy chains tightly around his own neck. Ashley suddenly let out a loud, hysterical shriek. The beautiful 30-year-old acquisitions director finally processed the terrifying reality of the situation. The frozen offshore accounts, the forged digital signatures, and the federal whistleblower complaints all added up to one undeniable conclusion. She was not going to be a wealthy socialite living in a multi-million-dollar mansion. She was going to federal prison. She backed away from Richard as if he were carrying a deadly, contagious disease. "You lied to me!" Ashley screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the expensive glass walls. "You told me the money was completely untraceable. You said she was just a stupid, boring accountant who would never figure it out. You ruined my life, Richard." She turned and ran toward the heavy double doors, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the polished marble floor. She was desperate to escape the boardroom and flee the building before the consequences of her boundless greed finally caught up with her. But Ashley did not even make it halfway across the room before her manicured hand could even reach the brass door handle. The heavy doors violently swung open from the outside. The sudden movement sent Ashley stumbling backward into a row of leather chairs. The loud, heavy sound of tactical boots hit the marble floor. A team of 6 federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division marched into the executive boardroom. They wore dark windbreakers with the bright yellow federal agency letters printed boldly across their backs. Their presence was a harsh, brutal reality check that instantly shattered the illusion of untouchable corporate privilege. The sterile, air-conditioned room suddenly felt incredibly small and suffocatingly tight. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, uncompromising face, stepped directly toward the head of the conference table. He did not care about the expensive tailored suits or the multi-million-dollar views of the Dallas skyline. He only cared about the massive red folder of undeniable evidence I had submitted the night before. He looked right past the stunned board members and locked his cold, hard gaze entirely onto my husband. Richard Sterling, the agent, announced, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "We have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, systemic corporate embezzlement, and massive federal tax evasion." Richard let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp. He raised his shaking hands as if he could physically push the federal charges away. Wait! Please wait! Richard stammered desperately, his face shining with a thick layer of cold, panicked sweat. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. I am the chief executive officer of this company. I have powerful friends. You cannot just march in here and do this. My wife is very sick. She is suffering from a massive paranoid delusion. She fabricated all of those documents to destroy me. I demand to call my private attorneys right now. The lead agent did not even blink. He had dealt with hundreds of arrogant, wealthy men who believed their money made them completely immune to the law. You are no longer the chief executive officer of anything, the agent replied, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. We have already reviewed the corporate charter amendments and the digital forensics provided by the true majority shareholder. The evidence is completely irrefutable. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The agent grabbed Richard by the arm, twisting him around and slamming him forcefully face first against the polished mahogany table. The loud, harsh click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Richard's wrists echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom. The sound was incredibly, deeply satisfying. It was the heavy, undeniable sound of absolute justice, finally catching up to a man who had spent his entire life running away from the truth. Richard struggled weakly against the cold metal, but the federal agents held him in an iron grip, completely neutralizing his pathetic attempts to maintain his dignity. At the same time, two other agents moved swiftly across the room and grabbed Ashley by her arms. She kicked and screamed wildly, tears ruining her perfect makeup and streaking dark black lines down her face. "Do not touch me!" Ashley cried hysterically as the cold steel cuffs snapped tightly around her own wrists. "I did not do anything wrong. He forced me to sign those papers. He manipulated me. I am a victim here." Her frantic, pathetic lies fell on completely deaf ears. The federal agents simply read her the Miranda rights and hauled her forcefully toward the exit, treating her exactly like the common criminal she truly was. The agents pulled Richard roughly away from the conference table. The man who had walked into that room believing he was an absolute god among men was now reduced to a weeping, sweating prisoner. The board members watched in stunned silence as the disgraced executive was paraded past them. Nobody offered a single word of support. Nobody offered to post his bail. They simply stared at him with cold, calculating eyes, mentally erasing his name from their valuable contact lists. His massive, fragile ego was breaking into 1,000 tiny pieces right in front of his elite peers. The public humiliation was absolute and total. The agents marched Richard toward the heavy glass doors to begin the long, agonizing walk of shame. The news of the federal raid had already spread like wildfire through the lower floors of the skyscraper. Hundreds of employees had gathered in the main lobby and the wide corridors holding their smartphones up to record the spectacular downfall of their arrogant boss. Richard would have to walk past every single receptionist, every single junior executive, and every single janitor he had ever disrespected. He would have to hang his head in absolute shame as the entire world watched his carefully constructed kingdom burn to ash. But before the agents could pull him out into the hallway, Richard suddenly stopped. He dug his expensive leather shoes into the carpet and turned his head to look directly at me. I was standing perfectly still near the center of the room, my white power suit immaculate and my posture completely unyielding. Bailey sat quietly by my side, offering a warm, comforting presence. Harrison stood slightly behind me, a look of dark, triumphant satisfaction on his sharp face. Richard stared at me with wide, terrified, bloodshot eyes. The mask of the confident predator was completely gone, replaced entirely by the desperate, weeping face of a broken coward. "Rebecca, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, miserable sob. "Please, do not do this to me. We have been married for 28 years. I gave you everything. I built this beautiful life for us. Please, tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you will drop the charges. I will give you anything you want. Just please, show me a little mercy, Rebecca. I am your husband." I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling in his expensive tailored suit. I thought about the decades I had spent silently balancing his books and covering his mistakes. I thought about the cruel laughter I had overheard behind the rose bushes at the country club. I thought about the forged psychiatric evaluations he had purchased specifically to lock me away in a cold, dark room for the rest of my life. I did not feel a single drop of pity or sorrow. The well of my compassion had run completely dry a long time ago. I took one slow, deliberate step toward him. The boardroom was so quiet that the sound of my breathing seemed to fill the entire space. I looked deep into his terrified eyes, letting him see the absolute freezing cold void where my love for him used to be. "You should have loved your wife, Richard," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and echoing with a terrifying, lethal calm. "I built this entire empire with my own two hands to keep you safe, and you treated my devotion like it was a weakness. You tried to throw me away like I was garbage. But as you so clearly said to your mistress just a few nights ago, even my dog has more worth than you." Richard let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure total defeat as the harsh reality of my words finally shattered the last remaining piece of his delusional mind. He sagged heavily against the federal agents, all the fight completely draining out of his body. He realized in that final, devastating second that there was absolutely no escape from the trap I had built. The agents pulled him roughly forward, dragging him out through the heavy double doors and into the blinding flash of the employee cameras waiting in the hallway. I stood perfectly still in the quiet, empty boardroom, watching the doors swing shut behind him. The oppressive heavy weight of his constant lies and his suffocating narcissism vanished completely, leaving behind a bright, clean atmosphere of absolute total liberation. I reached down and gently stroked Bailey's soft golden head, feeling a profound, deep sense of ultimate peace. The storm had finally passed, and the sky was perfectly clear. I had successfully reclaimed my life, my fortune, and my undeniable freedom. Women can sacrifice for love, and we can build massive empires for the men we trust, but we should never, ever be foolish. When you are backed into a dark corner and threatened by the person who promised to protect you, do not cry and do not surrender. Show them your true, undeniable strength, and let the absolute crushing weight of karma deliver the exact destruction they deserve. If you feel satisfied with this powerful ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what time it is where you are watching this video and where you are from in the comments below. The aftermath of the federal raid sent a massive, unprecedented shockwave through the entire commercial real estate industry in the state of Texas. Within 24 hours, the spectacular and completely devastating downfall of Richard Sterling was the lead headline on every single local and regional news network. The media aggressively broadcast his terrible mugshot across the city, showing the disgraced chief executive officer wearing a cheap standard-issue orange jumpsuit instead of his bespoke, perfectly tailored suits. His perfectly styled silver hair was an absolute mess, hanging limply over his sweaty forehead. His face was deeply pale, hollow, and completely stripped of the arrogant charm he had used to manipulate people for decades. I sat in my quiet, secure apartment sipping a hot cup of black coffee as I watched the breaking news reports roll continuously across my television screen. The man who had spent nearly 30 years meticulously crafting a flawless public image as a devout community leader was now entirely reduced to a pathetic, humiliated cautionary tale. The federal prosecutors moved with incredible, terrifying speed, thanks entirely to the massive encrypted dossier I had personally handed them. When Richard appeared for his initial arraignment hearing in federal court, his high-priced, desperate defense attorneys tried their absolute best to paint him as a victim. They argued passionately that he was a highly respected pillar of the Dallas community, a beloved country club member, and a generous churchgoer who posed absolutely no flight risk whatsoever. But the federal judge was a seasoned veteran, completely immune to Richard and his superficial manipulative charm. The judge looked down at the thick stack of irrefutable evidence detailing the offshore shell company and the frozen Cayman Islands bank accounts. The judge firmly slammed the heavy wooden gavel down and denied his bail completely, declaring Richard a massive, undeniable flight risk. Richard actually wept openly in the crowded courtroom, sobbing loudly and weakly as the armed federal marshals dragged him back to his cold concrete holding cell. He was completely broken. But the absolute final crushing blow to Richard's fragile, massive ego did not come from the federal government or the ruthless prosecutors. It came directly from the much younger woman he had sacrificed his entire marriage, his dignity, and his empire to impress. Ashley was sitting in a cold, sterile federal interrogation room, looking absolutely terrified. She was facing multiple heavy felony charges for wire fraud, corporate conspiracy, and international money laundering. Her expensive, tight red designer dress was wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. When the federal agents finally slid the thick file across the metal table and showed her the undeniable proof that the Crimson Acquisition's offshore accounts were completely permanently frozen, her entire greedy reality completely shattered. The millions of stolen dollars she thought she had secured were gone forever, trapped in a digital void she could never reach. The luxurious mansions, the expensive designer clothes, the endless international vacations, all evaporated into thin air. Without the promise of stolen wealth, Richard was absolutely nothing to her. He was just an arrogant, aging, broke man facing a decade in federal prison. Ashley did not hesitate for a single solitary second. The exact moment the federal prosecutors offered her a generous plea deal to reduce her own impending prison sentence, she completely flipped on my husband. She sang like a canary, eager to save her own skin, giving up every single intimate detail of their massive embezzlement scheme. She handed over his private encrypted text messages, she detailed their secret hotel meetings, and she formally testified that Richard had masterminded the entire fraudulent operation from the very beginning. She happily threw him under the proverbial bus to save herself. The profound, deep irony was absolutely delicious. Richard had thrown away a fiercely loyal, highly intelligent wife who had spent 28 years protecting him, shielding him from his own incompetence, just to run away with a selfish woman who sold him out the exact moment the bank accounts ran dry. Their grand, passionate romance was nothing but a cheap, highly transactional illusion built entirely on my stolen money. The sheer psychological devastation Richard experienced when he learned from his lawyers that Ashley had eagerly testified against him broke his spirit completely. He finally realized he had destroyed his own beautiful life for a parasite who viewed him as nothing more than a temporary walking ATM machine. He abandoned his expensive legal fight entirely and surrendered, pleading guilty to every single federal charge to avoid a lengthy, deeply embarrassing public trial. The sentencing hearing was a swift and brutal execution of absolute legal justice. Richard was sentenced to 10 long, hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He was permanently formally stripped of his precious country club membership, his wealthy peers publicly disavowing him immediately to save their own fragile social reputations. The massive, sprawling Texas estate he had used to stroke his massive ego was formally seized and legally liquidated by the Heritage Vanguard Trust to pay off the innocent vendors he had selfishly defrauded. The grand towering columns, the imported Italian marble floors, the expensive crystal chandeliers, everything he valued far more than human decency was auctioned off to the highest bidder. Ashley was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal prison. Her days of sipping expensive champagne on a private yacht were entirely replaced by a rigid, structured schedule and bland cafeteria food. She would spend the next half-decade mopping floors and staring at grey concrete walls, fully understanding that her boundless greed had completely ruined her youth. Richard's reality was significantly harsher. He was placed in a tough federal facility, surrounded by hardened criminals who did not care at all about his former status as a wealthy commercial real estate mogul. He spent his long, miserable days scrubbing toilets and his lonely, quiet nights staring at the ceiling, regretting the exact moment he ever decided to underestimate the brilliant woman he had married. He lost his vast wealth, his physical freedom, his pristine reputation, and his entire dignity. The towering empire of lies he had built collapsed entirely into a miserable pile of cold grey ash. A full entire year has passed since the bright morning I walked into that frosted glass boardroom and took my entire life back from the hands of a traitor. The blistering, oppressive Texas summer heat has finally faded into a crisp, cool, refreshing autumn breeze. I'm currently sitting on the sweeping wooden wrap-around porch of my beautiful, quiet, new lakeside home. The vast water in front of me is perfectly calm, mirroring the bright, vibrant orange and deep pink colors of the early morning sunrise. The fresh air smells intensely like green pine needles and cool, damp earth, completely different from the suffocating artificial cologne Richard constantly used to wear to mask his true nature. The gentle sound of birds singing in the tall trees replaces the chaotic noise of city traffic. Bailey is resting his heavy, warm golden head exactly where it belongs, right on my lap. I reach down and gently stroke his soft, thick fur, feeling a profound, deep sense of absolute, unshakable peace settling completely over my soul. The scared, invisible, obedient workhorse who used to hide quietly in the dark shadows of a massive, cold mansion is completely gone forever, replaced by a woman who fully knows her own terrifying worth. I am now the undisputed, highly respected Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Commercial Real Estate. We entirely rebranded the firm completely, washing away the toxic, ugly stain of Richard's ruined, pathetic legacy. Under my direct, unwavering leadership, the company has not only successfully recovered from the massive financial damage, but it has massively thrived beyond our wildest projections. We just closed a massive commercial contract for a new downtown high-rise, perfectly executed without a single ounce of fraud or deception. Without the constant heavy drain of Richard's reckless ego-driven spending and his endless systemic embezzlement, our profit margins have completely skyrocketed. I walk into the massive boardroom now, and I am met with absolute genuine respect from every single investor and board member. I am no longer the quiet, unseen wife silently balancing the complex books behind locked, closed doors to save her husband's reputation. I am the chief architect, the brilliant visionary, and the sole master of my own deeply successful destiny. I did not just barely survive the absolute worst betrayal of my entire life. I actively used the burning wreckage of my broken marriage to forge an entirely new, incredibly beautiful path forward. The heavy wooden screen door of the back porch creaks open softly behind me, breaking the quiet, peaceful morning silence. Firm, steady, confident footsteps walk slowly across the solid wooden deck. I do not have to turn my head around to know exactly who it is. A tall, handsome, imposing man steps smoothly into my peripheral vision, holding 2 warm, heavy ceramic mugs of freshly brewed black coffee. It is Harrison. He hands me a warm mug, his strong fingers gently, naturally brushing against mine. He smiles warmly, his dark eyes crinkling pleasantly at the corners. He takes a sip of his own coffee and leans over, gently kissing my temple. He sits down comfortably in the sturdy wooden Adirondack chair right beside me, looking out quietly over the peaceful, calm lake. Harrison had stood firmly, bravely by my side through the absolute darkest, most dangerous hours of my intense corporate war. He had been the sharp, brilliant legal sword I used to cut the final heavy chains binding me to Richard and his endless lies. But in the quiet, peaceful, healing months that followed the dramatic federal trial, our deep professional respect slowly, naturally blossomed into something entirely different and incredibly beautiful. There were no dramatic theatrical declarations of fake passion or childish manipulative games. It was a mature, deeply grounded, and incredibly genuine romance built solidly on a firm foundation of absolute equality and unshakable mutual trust. Harrison does not view me as a convenient tool to elevate his own professional status. He does not need me to shrink my own brilliant mind down to make him feel powerful or successful. He respects my boundaries and supports my ambitious vision for the future of Vanguard Real Estate. He looks at me every single day with eyes full of profound, deep admiration, actively celebrating my sharp intellect and my fierce, unyielding strength. We sit together in the quiet, cool morning light, 2 strong equals, sharing a beautiful life built on total, absolute honesty. I take a slow, deep, satisfying sip of the warm black coffee, leaning back comfortably in my wooden chair. I look at the incredible man sitting peacefully beside me, the loyal golden dog resting happily on my lap, and the massive, beautiful lake stretching out endlessly toward the bright horizon. The agonizing, terrible heartbreak of the past year feels like a distant, faded, blurry dream. The massive storm had aggressively tried to completely destroy me, to wash me away into nothingness, but it only succeeded in washing away the superficial dirt, revealing the absolute solid, unbreakable diamond underneath. Women can sacrifice, pour their hearts into building an empire, and stay silent for the sake of love, but we should never be foolish. When pushed to the brink and backed into a corner, dry, your tears, use your intellect, and show them your true strength. Karma never misses an address. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video? And where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.